This conference will now be recorded.
All right, are we ready to rock and roll then?
Indeed.
Nice. All right. Sorry, I'm using a different headset today, so I don't know if everyone can hear me as well, but hopefully everything's all right. Good morning. Welcome to our October meeting of the Tampa Bay Technical Advisory Committee. Thank you everyone for showing up and this is our fifth online only in a row? I can't even remember anymore. Does time matter? our series of talks in the after times. We've had great turnouts and wonderful presentations, so thank you everyone. Thank you to all the staff at TBEP, Maya, Gary, Marcus, everyone for taking care of this and setting everything up. It's really been a pretty seamless transition so far, so thank you. So I think we'll kick off and do our quick introductions. How many do we have on right now? I'm still not 42. Should we? That might take a bit of time. So do we want to run through Maya? It's up to you.
I think we should just get rocking and rolling. We have a lot of good topics on the agenda today.
Okay, so I think Noel's already in control and ready to go. So, Noel, I don't want to butcher your last name. How do you pronounce your last name? I'm sorry.
Bouquet.
Bouquet. All right. So Noel Bouquet from Ecology is going to lead us off today with her presentation on urban fishing and community well-being. So please, Noel.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the invite to be here. It's always really nice to connect with people, other folks who are working on Tampa Bay issues and just folks beyond Eckerd College where everything, as you can imagine, has been really intense lately. And we're doing hybrid, high flex outside teaching, which is quite the adventure. And I apologize that I can't stay for the whole meeting today just because I have to prep for my class right after this, but really appreciate being here. And I just wanted to talk to everyone about some research that I've been doing with my colleague, Jessie Fly. I'm in environmental studies and she's in anthropology, and I have a human geography background. So we're doing social science work. Both of us kind of got interested a few years ago in some of the shore fishing around Tampa Bay that we were seeing. And just got curious about, to what extent people might be using fishing to supplement their food security. So that's kind of where the idea started. And then we got interested in this academic idea of commoning. So our kind of academic research question is, is commoning happening around Tampa Bay shore fishing? And what does that look like in the minds of fishers and in the kind of biophysical realities. So commoning, quick definition, is the active and ongoing interactions between humans and non-humans in the process of negotiating benefits and needs for interlinked social ecological communities, which is just kind of a lengthy way of saying, is some kind of mutually beneficial relationship happening between humans and their natural resources. And ideally, in commoning, we would like to see that relationship going both ways. So natural resources providing some benefits for humans and humans providing some care and attention to natural resources. And then we had some other related questions. We were curious about how infrastructure, space, and well-being are interrelated. We had read a number of newspaper articles talking about bridges closing to fishing and that being frustrating for fishers, and a lot of new neighborhood rules coming into effect that banned fishing. So we were kind of thinking about infrastructure for shore fishing and its potential kind of disappearance around certain areas and what effects that would have. And then, like I mentioned, we were just curious to what extent are people relying on shore fishing for food? And then, how might shore fishers be incorporated into policy? And this was kind of in conjunction with some thinking that we were doing with some folks in Hawaii who are looking at subsistence fishing and shore fishing. And they're kind of working on federal definitions, some NOAA folks out there. So that was in the back of our minds too. So the first thing we did, we started with some just intercept interviews, actually with some of students from my fisheries governance class, which was really helpful just to kind of get to know some of the issues that people were thinking about. And then in the summers of 2018 and 2019, we did a bunch of surveys, just intercept surveys all around Tampa Bay. And then we've been doing an ongoing kind of historic newspaper data analysis, articles from about 1900 about fishing up to the present. We're only in the mid 1930s at the moment. It's slow going on the historical data analysis, but and then we were doing also systematic observations, just doing really detailed field notes and some kind of surveys of numbers of folks at different areas and things like that. So these are just our survey sites. This is where we were doing the intercept surveys. We kind of grouped, we're mainly looking at piers and parks, basically any publicly accessible fishing areas. We started out with the map that, I actually can't remember who produced the map, but there was a map of fishing piers around Tampa Bay, and we started with that, and then in talking with people, added some more locations. So basically, we kind of grouped these areas into what we call zones, and every summer day, our research assistants would randomly select a zone and then go to as many different locations within the zone as they were able to, also randomly selected. And so we had quite a number of spots all around the bay, and also we went up kind of the west coast of Pinellas County there as well. So what we found is that urban fishers are spending a lot of time out there fishing from shore. The mean time we found was 5.5 hours per trip, and the median was 5 hours. So pretty good indication of, substantial hours out there in these fishing spaces, in these shore spaces, fishing. And then we had 58% of people who fished for more than 6 times a month. So, they're going more than once a week. And we were kind of surprised at the time that many people were spending out there. We also found a lot of diversity. The diversity that we found in fishing spaces is more than we find in the underlying population of Tampa Bay. So we especially found a greater proportion of Asian fishers, but the Black and Latino percentages are also larger than the underlying Bay population. So they are very diverse spaces, which is kind of unique in Tampa Bay, which as you know, has a history of segregation and many places that are still quite segregated. So fishing areas are actually one place where people are more mixed.
Is it just me, or did Noel freeze?
I think we frozen.
Froze.
Yeah, we're froze.
If she gets back.
Gary, what'd you do?
I'm going to say it probably wasn't me, but I mean, I'm not swearing to anything. I was touching nothing. But I don't like the implication you instantly jump to me. I can accept it, but it's still,
I don't see Noelle still in my featured speaker.
No,
she's gone.
Got kicked off. Let's see if she can come back.
Well, Gary, I don't know if you noticed, but when I was introducing our presentations online, I said nearly seamless transition. So,
hey, there's some things we can't control for.
Gives us time to interact with each other. That's what these meetings are for anyway.
That's right.
I got big shoulders. I can accept causing problems. one of the things I'm best at.
Accepting the issue or causing the problem? You left that open-ended there.
Both. I mean, whatever you need, Dave.
Get her back.
Might have to take back control, Maya, and then give it back to her when she enters under a new instance.
Yes, but I'm not seeing her come back in. So I think maybe
Do we want to give her another minute here and then push ahead in case?
yeah, I think that's what we'll have to do. Just so everybody knows, her presentation, all of it is uploaded to the technical website, so you can view through there. Wow.
I have this vision we're still presenting somewhere and nobody being able to see it.
Yeah, and I don't have her cell phone to like text her. But she's not in the meeting attendees right now, so I think she will have known that she got. So I think we should probably move on, and if she comes back in, then we'll roll with it the best we can. That's all we can do. So I'm going to share controls now with Dr.
So next up is Dr. Thomas. Is it Plakhan?
Plakhan is correct, yeah.
Okay. Who is with us from USF, and hope you're ready to jump in there.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
All right, great. So Dr. Plakhan will be presenting on the historical ecology of ancient Tampa Bay.
So can y'all see my screen now?
Looking good.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, thanks for the invitation. We're really happy to be here and present to y'all today. I am a professor of anthropology here at USF, and I'm going to be presenting with my PhD student, Kendall Jackson, who is already a very advanced emerging scholar. You know, we're talking about ancient history, literally, but we like to think it has some resonance for contemporary society. So it's nice to talk to people who are studying contemporary estuarine ecosystems in Tampa Bay. And sorry that Noel got cut off, because at a broad level, we're talking about how common property systems of Native American societies in Tampa Bay responded to climate change in the distant past. But we hope it has resonance for understanding common property systems more generally. And then, of course, we also have smaller data sets that we hope could be used for sort of baseline studies of the ecology and ecological health of Tampa Bay's estuarine systems. Just a little background here, getting into it. A lot of people don't realize how common Native American sites are in the Tampa Bay area or in Florida in general. There are literally thousands of Native American sites that have been recorded around Tampa Bay. And that's just a drop in the bucket, because those are just the ones that are recorded. So there are a lot of Native American sites, even despite the development that's taken place around Tampa Bay. There's still Native American sites out there. And I also don't think people realize how common mound sites were around Tampa Bay. In fact, it's hard to quantify, but I'm willing to bet that the density of mound sites, of Native American mound sites, mounds of shell and earth, was greater along the shoreline of Tampa Bay than any other part of the Southeast, perhaps, with possible exception of some of the Mississippi Valley. And a lot of these mound sites were recorded by antiquarians in the late 1800s. In particular, there was a guy named S.T. Walker who lived in Clearwater. We don't know a lot about him, but he recorded a bunch of the mound sites in Tampa Bay as they existed around 1880. And we know from his map not only that there were a lot of mound sites, but that they were also kind of diverse in terms of shape and structure. At a basic level, there was a division that's common to the Southeast between kind of earlier dome-shaped burial mounds, and then it's somewhat simplistic dichotomy, but also later flat top platform mounds that either served in some cases as like stages for rituals or for the residences of chiefs. But Tampa Bay also had a bunch of unusual, huge shell works. One called Indian Hill at Cockroach Key. Walker talked about it was a landmark that people could see something like 6 miles out to sea. This was the skyline of Tampa Bay 1,000 years or so ago. These big shell works would have stood out across the landscape of Tampa Bay. Another down at Shaw's Point on the south side of the bay. Well, unfortunately, of course, a lot of these were destroyed beginning in the late 1800s. Florida is low, and as people started to, build roads, they saw a convenient source of fill in these shell mounds. Shell in particular was great for building roads because it gives good traction and stuff. So, in particular, like this is the mound at Bullfrog Creek that Walker recorded, the great shell heap at Bullfrog Creek near Gibsonton. And another antiquarian went back 20 years later after Walker and reported that it was almost completely destroyed. So we lost a lot, but there's still a lot around. And just a little bit more background, this is sort of the broad temporal framework for pre-Columbian societies in Tampa Bay and Florida in general. Settlement goes back all the way to 13,000 BC, but we're focused, most of the mound construction actually started in the Archaic period about 5,000 years ago, but we can tell that most of the mound construction in Tampa Bay and in general was in these last two periods, the Woodland period, and it's locally known as Weeden Island after the site in Pinellas County, and the Mississippian period, locally known as Safety Harbor for another site in Pinellas County. So those are kind of the focus of our study more. And there's an interesting transition there between the Woodland and Mississippian period. We know a good bit about the Mississippian period archaeologically, but also historically, because we have descriptions of the native societies in Tampa Bay from early Spanish explorers like Narvaez and Hernando de Soto. And what they describe is really kind of striking, especially in comparison to earlier periods. What the Spanish saw when they came to Tampa Bay was very fractured socio-political landscape with these highly territorial chiefdoms that were frequently at war with each other. And that's pretty consistent with what we know of this period more generally. Mississippian societies throughout the Southeast were kind of densely settled in like relatively permanent villages with kind of pronounced social hierarchies and chiefs at the top of those social hierarchies. That is much different than what we know of the earlier Woodland period that ended about 1000 AD. We don't see any of that clear evidence for social hierarchy. Lightly settled villages. We do get burial mounds, but they seem like more ritually associated than strikingly hierarchical. So something big happened about 1000 AD to transform those kind of more egalitarian social formations of the Woodland period into the more hierarchical societies of the Mississippian. And so, previous work elsewhere on the Gulf Coast, especially my work to the north up around the Crystal River area, we saw this transition happening too. And it seems at some level to be related to climate change. The Vandal minimum, kind of a generally cooler period but with a lot of variability, began somewhere towards the end of the Woodland period. And then we know that the medieval warm period began towards the start or towards the beginning, at least, of the Mississippian period. So we wouldn't say, that climate was necessarily the driving force, but the way human societies responded to those climate changes seems to have played part of these transition in human societies. So wrote a proposal to NSF to investigate this in the Tampa Bay area, and it was successful. So that's the research we're talking about today. We're just kind of still in the early stages, but real quickly, kind of to break it down, we kind of framed the research around 3 categories of material remains that we could study. One is, how did political organization change? And we're looking at that through trying to reconstruct the histories of the mound construction and use. And then we're tying that to changes in the subsistence economy, which we're investigating how shellfishing traditions are reflected in the archaeological record. And then the paleoecology and how the climate in Tampa Bay changed over the late Holocene. So I'm going to talk about the first 2, and then I'm going to hand it off to Kendall to talk about the last, which he's really kind of the leader on that paleoecological research. But we're just going to give you kind of a broad brush description of these 3 kind of things. In terms of investigating the histories of mound construction and use, we're going back to some of the extant mound sites. Some of you guys might recognize this is the mound in Philippi Park and Safety Harbor. It was probably the seat or the capital town of the chiefdom of Tocobaga that some of the Spanish explorers encountered. It's got a paved walkway up to the top now, so it's not exactly pristine, but it is amazingly intact, and it's a really dramatic location. If you've never been to Philippi Park, it's worth seeing. So there was some work done on this site in the 40s, like a lot of the mound sites around Tampa Bay, but you know, at that time, we didn't have radiocarbon dating or anything. So we're going back, we are reanalyzing that early work in the mound site, but we're also doing some other work to kind of reconstruct how the mound was built and the timing of the mound construction. So we're using things like ground penetrating radar. I'm not sure if this animation will work, we'll see. But the ground penetrating radar can give us an idea of like major construction episodes, especially in this mound. I don't think there it goes. The red and the yellow are kind of highly reflective layers, probably in this case a lot of shell that was used in the fill, and then the blue is probably less reflective soil layers. So that gives us, you know, a broad sort of picture of mound construction, and then we tie that with some really small diameter coring. We want to, you know, we want to be minimally invasive to these Native American mound sites, so we just use a small core. But it's enough to get us, in some cases, some really useful information. Here in Safety Harbor is really interesting. You can see these sharp breaks between the shell mound construction episode and this marine clay that they were using to build the mound. Pretty unusual. And these also, we can pick out small pieces of carbon to radiocarbon date so that we can date the different mound construction episodes. So we're doing that at several mound sites around Tampa Bay. And then the second thing we're doing is, as I said, looking at the economy. So at some of these sites, we're going back and putting in small sample holes. We call these shovel tests. They're about 50 centimeters in diameter, square. And you can see this is from the Cockroach Key site. And I wish I could show you better. This site is really heavily vegetated, so it's hard to get a good photo. But this site, the mound is 10 meters tall. It's one of the tallest mound sites on the west coast of Florida, and it's basically an anthropogenic island, about 300 meters long and about 75 meters wide. That is just all shell from food that Native Americans ate and left behind, and purposefully constructed into these huge mounds. And so we can't really get to the bottom of this, but here's one of our shuttle tests that you can see just the density of shell. This goes down close to 2 meters that we excavated, about the limit of what we can do in one of these tests. And it's all just dense oyster shell, scallops, moon snails, things like that. And of course, there's also a lot of fish bone, pottery mixed in too. And so we use that, and we're quantifying the species that are represented. That gives us an idea of like the catchment area, the different habitat that people were exploiting, because we know that there's this transition in the territoriality of these humans, of these native societies. So if we can reconstruct what habitats they were exploiting, we can maybe get an idea how far afield they were collecting resources and when that transition to where they were more restricted. So we get a lot of oyster, we get a lot of other species. We're quantifying that for different sites around Tampa Bay to see how it changed over time. We're also doing studies of oyster health and ecology, measuring the oysters, and we're already, we can't really quantify it yet, but there's something going on in Tampa Bay somewhere around this transition, because the sites that date to the woodland period are really big, healthy oysters, 20 centimeters long. And then when we get into the 1300s and 1400s, the oysters are really much smaller and not as healthy. There's a lot of sponge boring and parasites on the oysters. So something's going on. This is a representation just from a single unit on a site, Cabbage Head up in Upper Tampa Bay Park, where you can see it goes from the bottom, the lower depths, and the mean oyster length, and you can see how much larger it is at the lower depths than at the upper depths. So that's a change over time from lower to more recent at the top, and you can see it represented there in a single site. And then we're also doing, I've got a colleague at the University of Georgia, and we're doing isotopic studies of oysters. We split these oyster shells in half lengthwise, and then do we use mass spec to get the carbon-13 and oxygen-18 on representative samples along the shell. That can reconstruct water temperature and salinity, but we also use it because, like, we can tell, again, if they were exploiting different oyster habitats. Does it look like the oysters are coming from a single sort of habitat, or are they collecting more broadly, which gets us back to some of those territorial issues we're interested in. And here I'm gonna hand it off to Kendall. I won't try to change screens again, but Kendall's going to talk about the paleoecological component of this research.
Sure. Howdy. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Great. Awesome. So part of this larger program is getting a handle on sort of the late Holocene climate situation, climate change going on, as well as sea level dynamics, and in general, sort of shifting estuarine habitats and coastal habitats on sort of millennia scales. So we're looking at this, of course, with the archaeological data, but also with some sort of targeted paleo-environmental sampling with cores. So we're taking two different types of cores. To get deeper records, we're taking vibration cores or vibra cores. You can see these are taken from a little pontoon boat, from sort of deep intertidal to in subtidal environments. We take them on linear transects that just sort of run seaward from the shoreline. And we're getting out to about 1 kilometer away from the shoreline into about 2 meters of water or so, taking cores along that transect. And if we could just change the slide to the next one, it'll give you some info. Yeah, so with the vibration cores, it allows you to get a much deeper record, something we're getting to, most of the cores are getting below 5 meters sediment depth, which is really wonderful. You never know what you're gonna get. But with this sediment depth, we're getting pretty full Holocene sedimentary sequences. Many of them are bottoming out into the limestone, which is great. So what this will allow us to do is sort of reconstruct the pace and the character of Holocene marine transgression in nearshore portions of Tampa Bay, which is a big knowledge gap at the moment, because most of the good paleoecology records for Tampa Bay are from very deep portions of middle Tampa Bay, and they more or less stop at mid-Holocene, about 5,000 years ago. So we're hoping with these cores to sort of pick that record back up and start telling this history of nearshore portions of Tampa Bay estuary, answering questions like, when did intertidal environments set up in the nearshore portions of the estuary, and at what pace did they migrate landward to their present position? And of course, these deep cores in the organic sediment layers were also able to run radiocarbon dates on some of those strata, so when certain environmental transitions were happening. And a big part of the climate picture is to analyze fossil pollen assemblages that accumulated in those organic sediments. Analyzing those, we can get a picture of what local vegetation communities were present and how those vegetation communities and the habitats they are part of changed over some of these cultural period transitions. How is climate changing? Can we get a strong Vandal minimum climatic signature? And how did that broader climate episode play out in Tampa Bay? And same thing, how did the transition to the Roman warm period play out locally? So we'll answer some of those questions with fossil pollen and with charcoal concentrations. That can tell us quite a bit about fire frequency and things like that. If we just go to the next slide. So we're also taking percussion cores, or what I like to call pound cores, because it gives you a very good idea about how we drive them in. It's just with a sledgehammer and a block of wood, very human powered, which is great because then we don't have to bring any heavy equipment or machinery into the tidal wetlands. So these are shorter cores. They'll capture a record from 1 meter to about 2.5 meters or 3 meters below the surface. And these we're taking in tidal wetlands that are landward or leeward sort of large shell works. So in like tidal wetlands that are protected from the open bay by archaeologicals. And with these, we're getting a much more recent record of environmental change. I think we're getting back probably about 2,000 years with these. So it's giving us a nice late Holocene record where we can show the timing and sort of character of sea level change and tidal wetland development. And it also, with these pound cores, we're also able to sort of catch the limits of the shell works themselves, of the archaeological shell works, and sort of place these archaeological sites directly into geological and ecological context. So we can show exactly what type of environment the sites were built on and how those environments surrounding the sites changed over the period of occupation. And then of course, subsequently, how those environments have changed over the historic period and into sort of the 19th and 20th century. And of course, there are some really interesting dramatic changes coming out of the very recent record across the 19th and 20th century that we're working on as well. Next slide. So I'm still working on the deep vibrocores. I've got a lot of them and I'm slicing them open and looking at the records, but I don't have them diagrammed yet. But I do have this cross-section diagram that has several of our pound cores at Cabbage Head Bayou site, which is up in Upper Tampa Bay Park. And this is sort of a transect of core samples with one shovel test there as well that gives you sort of a cross-section of the archaeological site and its surrounding wetlands. So for instance, pound core 3 all the way to the left is taken in the mangrove fringe seaward of the shell mounds. And then you have the shell mound record in shovel test 1. And then you can see the slope of the shell work in 4 and 1. And then in pound core 2 and 5, that's in a mangrove flat extending landward from the shell work. So looking at these records, we can sort of track ecological change and environmental change over time and figure out what the substrate is for these sites, and we can pair these ecological changes with what's going on in the subsistence economy and in social and political changes in the archaeological record at the sites. And that's what I've got.
Yeah, so like I said, we've just to wrap up, we're trying to get a representative sample around the Tampa Bay. We're relying on new field work and also as much as possible making use of existing collections. So the red are sites where we've already done field work or are planning to do field work, and the blue are where we're hopefully pulling some samples from existing collections, especially of the oyster shell that we can use for the isotopic studies. And so that, we're happy to take any questions if there's time, or please don't hesitate to contact us via email to follow up on anything that might be of interest.
Great. Okay. I was wondering about the shell length trend over time. So do you think that it's like some combination of climatic phenomena and the possibility of like an over-harvesting? I mean, those shell mounds are a lot of oysters where they weren't brought back into the bay to serve as cults, or is that just, I guess it's too simplistic to say it's just over-harvesting, it's just climate change. Do you think it's probably a combination of the both, or?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I suspect it is a combination of both. It'll be interesting. We've seen this at a couple sites or in a couple different parts of the bay. We're hoping we can get enough samples to see whether it's a bay-wide phenomenon or if it's restricted to particular parts of the bay. If it's restricted to particular parts of the bay, I might lean towards saying it's more over-harvesting or human-induced factor. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Right now, I can't say. I can't say either way.
Thanks.
Hey, Tom, it's Randy Reynolds, Tampa Bay Aquatic Preserves. I spent a lot of time acquiring the land around Harbor Key, the sites y'all done down there and all in the past, and we've certainly found a lot of sites there over the years. But the big gap, I guess, is submerged sites, and we've talked about doing probability models and things, but does your program have any plans to, I guess, expand the search for submerged sites, shallow submerged sites?
No, not really. I mean, we're focusing really on the last 1,500 to 2,000 years. So sea level until recently has been, relatively stable over that time frame. It is definitely. We're losing some of these sites, especially some of the smaller shell middens that don't have the topographic relief. So it is a concern. But Kendall is picking up some of this with using the cores and picking up some of the shell midden that is now below the water level. But we don't really have the time and resources to go searching for additional sites on this study, at least. It is something that it would be good to do, especially, for the potential for earlier archaic period mound sites before sea level stabilized.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, this is Justin Sarin, and I have just a question about paleoecology. Great. I mean, sounds like the methods are right on. It's awesome to see them progressed. I'm just curious about some of the results. Are there? You were talking about charcoal. I was wondering, are you seeing any signal with either natural fire or anthropogenic fire in any of those cores?
Well, right now, that's still a research question for us, and I haven't started running any of the charcoal concentration analysis yet. That'll sort of, I'm sort of subsampling for all of that right now, as well as I'll probably run it concurrently with the pollen analyses. So I don't have any results on that yet, but it's sort of as you probably know, it's sort of notoriously difficult to tease apart natural fire from anthropogenic fire in paleoecology records. As soon as somebody sort of thinks they have a really good method to tell them apart, it gets thrashed, you know. But we're going to give it a whirl, and we'll definitely be tracking sort of the pattern of charcoal deposition. And I think that we'll be able to do that well. And then teasing out what portion of it is anthropogenic versus natural fire, we'll be able to try to get to that probably through correlation with other data sets. Yeah. I guess I should say though, I would presume anthropogenic fire is going to be recorded in the cores, because we're taking these core samples with such proximity to archaeological sites where fires were surely burning consistently for very long periods of time. So there should be an anthropogenic fire signature.
Any other questions for Tom or Kendall?
Sure. Gary Rollerson here. Thanks, y'all. That's good information. Thinking about the following up on Dave's question, thinking about the changes in shell sizes. Going back to, there was something recently produced, I can't remember if it was FPAN or something, somebody that showed an oyster shell from Tampa Bay that was like this, 6 inches long, not 6 centimeters. And have you all done any comparative work with current size oysters? Because I think even the ones we're seeing now in some monitoring studies are even smaller than that, 6 to 8 centimeters on average.
Well, just with Greg Herbert in geosciences here at USF, we published some research from further up the coast, up in the Crystal River area, comparing archaeological samples from the interval around 500 to 1000 AD with modern samples from the same area. And there was a definite drop off in the big oysters there. And Greg and his PhD students did most of the work on that, but it seems like it was reduced rates of growth in the summer months is what they were able to tell from the isotopic signatures, which could be due to pollution or water temperatures. That part of it is kind of less certain, but that was published in Biology Letters. We are hoping that that there could be some similar sort of articulation with Greg and his students on this study. It's pretty clear that those big oysters drop out between, if you compare like, the early end of our study period, like 2000 years ago versus modern. I think what we're already seeing though is that drop off was just not in modern times, but pre-Columbian times there was a drop off, and there might have been a rebound even in the early historic period when a lot of the Native American populations were reduced. Greg is really keen on getting some samples from the 1700s and 1800s, which is kind of the missing piece of the puzzle, but those are hard to find. So we're talking about maybe some future research that would be directed at least partially towards filling in that gap. So we get the kind of complete timeline and kind of contract. It's clearly not just I would say not just a linear, it's a little more up and down than we might think.
Hey, Tom, I had this strange, I was at a talk one time and they were talking about how, North American settlers had changed woodlands by using firewood. And maybe this is related to charcoal, maybe not, but they were basically saying that like humans don't just collect trees and burn them. They collect certain types of trees. And if you've ever been camping, you might not want to have a fire cooking your oysters with pine trees. You might want to have oak trees, because of the sap and the oil and all that stuff. And I have no idea if that's relevant, but I do remember that they're basically saying that, settlers changed the trees, but it was a selective, you went out for oak trees, not just, whatever nearby tree, if that would be helpful or not. I just kind of just remembered that presentation.
Yeah, we do see, we're not getting into it so much. It would be nice to have somebody look at the charcoal, the macro fossils, and identify them. We'll do a little bit of that, but the way firewood might have changed. We do think, what we're looking at more is the way the construction of these big mound complexes might have changed the whole estuaries, because some of these appear to be like they're building these anthropogenic islands almost like at the front, at the bay side of these, really productive estuarine areas, almost as if they're claiming them, or making a visible sort of territorial claim. But also I think that it's got to change some of the hydraulics somewhat. So Kendall's going to get into that a little bit in his dissertation.
Yeah, which would certainly have an impact on the tree species that are dominant in the high intertidal zone.
I think this was a really interesting talk, and I'm really grateful that you all were able to come and present this work. If you don't follow them on Instagram, you should. You can see some sweet oyster pics and some of the field work they've got going on. So it's a good follow on Instagram. Also, just please keep us in the loop as your work progresses. I think there's a lot of overlap with some of your research questions with some of the work that Gary is doing, monitoring oysters right now, and some of the work that we've been doing looking at critical coastal habitats and how they're keeping pace with sea level change today in contemporary times. So I think there's some nice overlap there. I really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
Noel,
thank you for having us.
Yeah, great. Noel is back, and I'm going to actually share my screen. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, thanks, and sorry about that. I just I wasn't able to tell that I was cut off, so I just happily gave my whole talk. So it was good practice. So here we go again. So yeah, in regard to one of our main research questions, of course, we found that about 17% of the fishers who are shore fishing sometimes or often did not have enough money to buy food in the past year, which is the federal definition of food insecurity. So a number of food insecure fishers are out there, and we found that about 11% of them, of our total, said that fishing helped to keep my household from going hungry. So they were using fishing specifically to help supplement their food security. Okay, next slide. Here's just a couple quotes. We found a lot of quotes similar to this. People saying, this one person said, "Some people fish for sport, I fish for support." So specifically kind of juxtaposing themselves with sport fishers and saying, no, that my reason for fishing, is to shore up my food security, essentially. And similarly, someone else said, the water is my grocery store. So certainly a lot of folks, focusing specifically on the nutritional value of what they're getting from fishing. Okay. And then we also found amongst people who were not necessarily food insecure, but just generally amongst the population, about 77% of folks were cooking and eating their catch. We found a wide variety of species being fished. And people are, keeping a good number of fish. We found a median of 4 fish being kept. The average was 5.6. So a fair number of fish are being kept, and about half of folks are also sharing fish with friends and neighbors. So definitely a social activity and also a food supplement. Okay. And we also found a number of people who were really emphasizing the mental health benefits of fishing. And if you are a fisher, you might recognize these, right? People talking about just feeling at peace out on the water. This person said it's a stress relief. You're out there, you're burning time, you're letting the world melt away. And we found that people said these types of things even when they were not fishing in a location that we might typically find aesthetically pleasing, which was interesting. Just a lot of different locations, people emphasizing this theme of stress relief and being at peace out near the water. Okay. And so similarly, social and cultural benefits, people talked about interacting with others, with friends and family, and with learning from more experienced fisher people. So this person said, I just moved here. I come to the park a lot because I can talk to people that have more experience than I do. And we found this to be a very common theme. Of course, Florida being a place where we get lots of transplants, we certainly found that there was this kind of educational aspect of the social interaction out in shore fishing locations. Okay, next slide. And we also found at the same time social tensions, right? So there's tensions between catch and release fishers and people who are trying to fill their buckets, especially, of course, concern about keeping undersized fish, keeping more fish than the limit allows. So there were those sorts of tensions. And then we also found tensions between people fishing from piers and people on boats who would come near the piers, kind of territorial disputes where people were frustrated that, others were kind of honing in on their fish, and particularly boaters. Okay. And also social tensions around, like I mentioned before, kind of the closures of fishing spaces that used to be open, such as from bridges and neighborhood locations, just tensions around, fishers sometimes being accused of leaving litter and broken glass and things around these sites, and fishers then feeling frustrated that there were no facilities such as trash cans or restrooms, and that their kind of historical fishing rights at these areas were being infringed upon. So definitely some social tensions around locations as well. Okay. So just to kind of summarize what we found to be the key dimensions of urban fishing in Tampa Bay, we found this kind of triumvirate of contributions to well-being, sort of social, cultural, mental, and nutritional contributions. We found a lot of cross-generational teaching of skills, as well as cross-cultural communications and these diverse spaces. Of course, Tampa Bay has this history of segregation, and I think a lot of public spaces in particular are still fairly segregated. And it's interesting that fishing spaces are actually some of the most diverse spaces in the region. And so even though we sometimes see tensions, at least people are interacting, which is interesting. And then we saw, kind of for better or for worse, social ecological connectivity, right? So sometimes we found, we found people who were specifically feeding birds, which of course is not ecologically the correct actions, but it was interesting to hear them talk about their relationship with the fish life, the bird life, and the value that they placed on it. Okay, next slide. So we, have these questions around, is this recreational fishing? Well, yes, but what else is it? Can we label it? Are there definitions that might be more appropriate for especially folks who are using fishing to really supplement their food security? And we're, having these conversations with our colleagues in Hawaii. But I like this statement from Clay and Olson, which talks about how defining fishing communities inevitably raises these complicated issues of place, identity, and economy. And Schumann and Machinka, who talk about we really do not know that much about subsistence fishing or fishers, and who argue that we need definitions of subsistence fishing before management can take place, but also that such definitions should be context dependent. And we really found this to be true in Tampa Bay because we have so many, unique spaces here, and the community makeup is unique. And so I certainly would agree, doing this research, that any kind of different definition should probably be context dependent for sure. Okay. And we're also looking to the urban foraging literature. So there's this kind of burgeoning literature on urban foraging, which mainly is land-based, talking about, people gleaning fruits and vegetables and other resources from urban spaces. Shackleton defines foraging as gathering raw biological resources, primarily for direct consumption, decoration, crafts, barter, small-scale sale. But there's this emphasis on multifunctionality, which we, again, really found in our survey results. Individuals and communities of foragers may obtain multiple benefits from foraging. So if we think about urban fishing as a type of foraging, and certainly, fish are the biggest source of wild food, still left to most people in general, and certainly urban populations, that we do see this kind of multiplicity of benefits, social and nutritional and mental benefits from fishing. Okay. And I just like this list of kind of characteristics of, the benefits that urban foraging does provide. So frequently used resources. We really saw this in Tampa Bay, acting like a coping strategy or safety net, especially for those food insecure folks. Offering savings, they're not having to spend money that they otherwise might at the grocery store. And so, it's contributing to food and health security and creating and sustaining connections to nature and place, which, again, this was a big theme that came up as well during our interviews, and supporting identities and cultures too. Okay. So there's this question about, is this subsistence fishing? And in 2017, there was a federally proposed definition, which I don't think got ultimately passed, but this is still sort of what's being tossed around at NOAA, that subsistence fishing means fishing in which the fish harvested are intended for customary and traditional uses. This is kind of problematic in an urban setting for a number of reasons. We have people with different types of customs, so traditions and customs might be multiple. Also, a lot of people just getting into fishing, right? We had someone tell us that their friend at the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting told them that it was really great for mental well-being, and so they were out there for the first time fishing, but they were also food insecure. So I think this emphasis on the multiple benefits is kind of more important than a narrow definition of subsistence fishing. Okay. But there's potential benefits for defining this type of shore fishing for policy purposes. One being, we could highlight fishing's importance to diverse populations and communities, which I think tend to be overlooked in a lot of fisheries policymaking. We could similarly, highlight the importance to food insecure populations, which could really be better articulated in debates about coastal land use change and water access, as we see, fewer and fewer kind of water access locations, and could potentially create more support for a shore-based versus a boat-based infrastructure. Around Tampa Bay, we see a lot of really nice boat ramps and a lot of kind of infrastructure for launching a boat, but for people who can't afford to do that, I think we don't see as much support for a shore-based fishing infrastructure. Okay. And then at the same time, there's some drawbacks to potentially defining this group or community of people in policy. Number one being fishers don't necessarily want a spotlight on their activities, especially if they're not documented or not U.S. citizens. There's a fear that this could lead to further license requirements or fees, which would, obviously be detrimental, especially to food insecure folks, which would, not be a goal that we would be interested in, at least speaking for my colleague and I. Okay. So just want to end on some emerging questions that we're thinking about. So we really want to think more broadly about how does shore fishing kind of affect social ecological resilience in coastal communities? Could it help people bounce back from various socio-natural disasters? We're curious more specifically what characteristics of fishing spaces, their level of formality, legality, accessibility, and so forth. How do these relate to the emergence of commoning behaviors? We're curious to learn more about whose definitions of resilience or well-being are kind of prioritized in governance strategies and what effect those have had on distributions from shore fishing spaces. And then with the pandemic, of course, we're getting more curious about what role might urban fishing play in responding to pandemic stress and economic hardship, especially given how much people talked to us before the pandemic about the stress relief of the practice of fishing. So just curious, and we're thinking about how we can look at this while maintaining social distancing with our research assistants. So it's an interesting challenge, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
We have one question in the chat from Dan Glazier.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. I guess I'll put my video on so you can see me. I'm Dan Glazier with Pinellas County Utilities. I see some old faces and friends from years past and recently. Dave, Gary. Hey, I came to Florida, to Tampa in 1977. As a young man, I worked various jobs, but on the way to driving to work, whether I lived in Tampa or after I moved over to Clearwater, I noticed a lot of mullet jumping in Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay. I mean, crazy in the mornings and in the afternoons. Has something changed in our bay and our bays since that time that the mullet have left, or were they overfished, or was it pollution related? It's just kind of a general question. I figured all you smart people here, somebody would know the answer to that question. Anybody?
I don't study mullets, so I would not be the person to answer that. Although it was my impression that with the net ban in the early 90s in Florida that the mullet were coming back. But perhaps there's a biologist here who knows more than I do about that.
I don't know if anybody else can agree with that or remember that time in the late 70s, early 80s when the mullet were crazy jumping in the water.
Tim, are you with us still?
Yeah, this is Tim McDonald. We don't have data that goes back to the 70s and 80s, so I really can't tell you what. I run the Fisheries Independent Monitoring Program at FWRI. I cannot tell you that they have increased or decreased since the 70s and 80s, but I can tell you they're pretty much stable since the net ban. It's a schooling fish, and it's hard to they tend to have a patchy distribution. So where they are one day and you see them jumping, they may not be the next day. So it's really hard to say off of a perception like that. But I can tell you that since the net ban, they've been stable in Tampa Bay and throughout Florida.
Okay, thank you.
And this is Randy Rollins. I've actually, been pretty awestruck by some of the schools down at Terracea at times where you just want to turn off the boat and watch the water boil toward you with a big school of mullet. So there, you still can see things like that. I don't know how that goes with as far as frequency in the bay, but you still can find those boiling schools of mullet out there if you're in the right place at the right time. I had one question, I guess, for Noel. Have you done much to compare what you're finding in Tampa Bay with other urbanized estuaries in Florida? And I'm thinking especially as to how the perception of the health of the estuary drives fishing. And I'm thinking about places like Biscayne Bay, which recently, of course, probably the perception of the health of that estuary has diminished quite a bit. I've been talking to our managers down there, and also Indian River Lagoon and places like that. I know Indian River Lagoon, other questions I have about those things are like, why are certain species like puffers targeted more by fishermen in Indian River Lagoon, but that's not really a problem here in Tampa Bay. I was wondering if you've done anything comparatively among those urban estuaries around Florida.
Not yet. We're certainly interested in doing some more comparisons geographically, but yeah, this is still sort of a new project. So basically piloting it here, and we're hoping to do some potentially, cross-state work as well. I know there's some folks working on urban fishing in New Orleans, Louisiana area. So we're interested in looking, more broadly around the Gulf, especially. But yeah, that's really interesting. I would love to look at those issues in those places that you mentioned.
And if you ever get a chance, we looked at subsistence fisheries in South China. I worked with an environmental economist over there who looked at the village economies and subsistence fishing villages near a mangrove reserve I was working with, and it's very interesting. Gives you insights. It's so far out of the box of what we deal with here. It's really amazing to look at some areas where the rules that apply here don't apply at all.
Oh yeah, I would be fascinated to hear more about that work. Interesting.
Chris Kaufman has a question.
Hi, Noelle. I just had a quick question for you on I was interested if you had if you've published any literature on your work yet, and then also what group at NOAA or what staff members at NOAA in Hawaii you were working with. I was just interested in understanding kind of the players in subsistence fishing right now. We have some interest at the NOAA Restoration Center where I work in St. Pete in exploring subsistence fishing, and also working with some folks in the Gullah Geechee community in northern Florida and South Carolina who are also traditionally subsistence fisher people. So I was just interested in if you have literature and who you're working with in NOAA in Hawaii.
Oh, yes. So we have our first paper is under review right now in applied geography. So with the pandemic, the process seems to be moving quite slowly, but hopefully we'll have our first paper out soon. And I'm happy to share also, other presentations that we've done at conferences and so forth as well. But yeah, I've mainly been working with Kirsten Leong and her group in Hawaii, and they have been trying to develop some sort of systematic way to define subsistence fishing in Hawaii and the whole South Pacific territorial area, because of course they have a very long history of subsistence fishing and cultural traditions, Native American traditions. So in some ways it differs somewhat from our kind of urban fishing here, but at the same time, many of the benefits that people talk about are quite similar. So it's been a really interesting kind of partnership, and I'm happy to link you up with them if you wanted to email me. But yeah, I'm curious to hear more about your work in South Carolina as well.
Great, thank you.
Aaron?
Yeah, hey, Noelle, thank you so much for an awesome presentation there. Are you looking into at all the catch as far as regulated versus unregulated species that these sustenance fishers are pulling in? I'm sure they might get a little touchy about you going through the bucket, but I'm interested as far as those that are depending on this as a source of food, if they're sticking to a lot of the more traditional food species, or if they're a little more outside of the box, especially based on some of the variations in the cultural backgrounds that you're seeing out there.
Yeah, we would love to get into that. We haven't yet. We're still trying to obtain more funding because we'd love to not only look at that kind of thing, but also do some testing for, contaminants, just to see what people are ingesting, if they are relying heavily on, some of these fish species. Are they also gathering perhaps shellfish that might be contaminated? We would love to look at more of that, and we're also looking for potentially a biologist or ecologist to partner with, because that's not really our area of expertise. But yes, great questions, and we're certainly, interested in looking at that further.
Gary had a question.
Yes, again, thank you, Noel. It's good information. I'm wondering about the demographics. If I remember from the map with the pins, you did have the your locations where you're doing the questions grouped into different spatial bins. Did you notice any differences in demographics among the different bins? And was that maybe related to where those populations were concentrated for living, or were they more scattered, based on where the fish are, or what their species they were going after?
Yeah, we've looked at that a little bit, and to some extent, people are gathering nearby to where they live. But also there's a few places that tend to just draw a lot of people. So the Skyway Bridges, this is probably not surprising to many of you. The Fort DeSoto piers, those are seeing many more fishers, and interestingly, a lot of the food insecure fishers will pay the entrance fees to get onto, the old Skyway fishing areas because they can spend all day and it's more productive. They can come home with more fish. So there's some really interesting kind of economic trade-offs that seem to be being made where they're willing to invest a little bit more to come home with a bigger catch.
Ed has a question. Oh, Brian, I skipped you. I'm sorry.
I had one. I was just curious. It's a really interesting study, and I think I don't know if this has already been done or maybe something to do going forward, but understanding where is there access within our region for shoreline fishing, and doing sort of like a productivity analysis or something at each of those places, or even comparing it to communities and doing community analysis in terms of access. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's another area. I mean, we're just really, really interested in, and also just the shifting access over time. So that's something that we're looking at in the historical records as well. And we're hoping to extend it beyond the newspaper records, but also looking at, aerial photographs and just the extent of development in conjunction with the kind of stories about fishing access that have been published, throughout the decades. And we're already seeing questions about this in the 1930s, which I didn't expect to see until maybe the 60s. So it's kind of interesting how long conversations about water access and fishing access have been happening.
And for those of you who, didn't have the pleasure, this was a primary interest of Jan Platt's, as her perception of the loss of shore-based fishing opportunities throughout the region with bridge closures and some of these conflicts that Noel was talking about. I think that there are things that we've identified, but maybe haven't looked into as much as we did, like some of the boat ramp access issues in the early 2000s. For example, I'm thinking about that. Ed, did you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, it's mostly a follow-up to what you were just saying. User conflicts is an issue that we've identified in our current comprehensive management plan, and I don't think the conflicts are going to go away, particularly with subsistence fishers and their access to areas to fish in the future as the population continues to increase. So I was just curious if you had any sort of rough estimates of the percentage of the population that might be classified as the subsistence fishers, or those food insecure individuals that might be relying on marine organisms for a primary component of their diet. Have you formed any estimates yet with your work?
Well, I can just speak to, the percentages in our sample. So we had about 17% who could be federally classified as food insecure.
But that's within the fishers you interviewed, and not necessarily an estimate of what that represents within the population of the bay?
Yeah, I mean, we had a random sampling procedure for our surveys, but certainly, it's a really difficult population to get like a sampling frame from. So we certainly, that's why we did the kind of spatial sampling procedure instead of, they're not really written down anywhere. So it's challenging to get a true random sample, but yeah, that's sort of the best we could do. But it seems to be, the more we survey, the more that number, 17, 18%, seems to be sticking. So I would say, and we certainly have had a large coverage of the fishing areas. So I think it's a reasonable estimate of the folks who are at least shore fishing to supplement their food security.
Marcus had a question.
Yeah, I just had a short question following up on Aaron's comment about types of catch in relation to regulations. And this is really for anybody on the call that might know. I'm curious if there are creel surveys or like shore-based point of access surveys that can supplement this information. I know that occasionally demographics are captured as part of those surveys, but they would get more at what are people actually catching versus, in relation to the regulation. So I'm wondering if anybody knows that answer.
The FWR, this is Tim McDonald. FWRI does have fisheries dependent monitoring, and they do that type of stuff. It's not at the scale that you would want for this. They don't do it at a high enough density for, say, Tampa Bay to be a specific point of interest, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, I was, it's just a thought I had, because once upon a time I used to do creel surveys, and that's the type of information that we would get, and it seems like it would be a good opportunity to reconcile these two sources of data with what Noel has and sort of a more formalized assessment in relation specifically to the regulation.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think our data is at the scale you need.
I just, recommend to everyone that we keep these kinds of research questions at the top of mind as we look at, we're almost 5 years into our new CCMP. And so we'll be sort of reevaluating some of those research and monitoring priorities and reporting on progress, implementing the actions that we have. And I think this is an area where we obviously have a lot more to learn, and it's of, utmost importance to sort of the story of Tampa Bay. And we still have a lot of questions. And so let's be thinking about collaborations here on this topic. I know Noel's got to go, so.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your great questions and ideas. Really appreciate it.
And just on that point, if Noel, just following up with you on the question I had, if we look at that 17% as representative, what might be within the Tampa Bay population, we're talking about 530,000 folks that might be classified as food insecure. So to me, that's a major research question that we need to address, if that's the true population of folks that are relying on marine resources for some component of their diet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that many people would be relying on the fishery resources. I know that in Tampa Bay, estimates of folks who are under the poverty level sits around 14%. So yeah, I mean, just of the people who are out fishing, it seems to be around 17% who are food insecure. So yeah.
I just view this as one of our more important environmental justice issues in the watershed that we probably haven't done as much work on, and we could be better served to consider some of these management questions that Noel has raised with respect to shore-based fishing opportunities. I know it's a hot topic in my neighborhood. People get called, the cops called on them all the time for trying to fish in the private lakes around here, and I'm sure that comes up in other places too. So anyways, for what it's worth, we appreciate you being able to be with us and give your presentation twice, Noel.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
What you got?
Rejoining, but like the number that Ed just calculated. So I volunteer at Feeding Tampa Bay, and their estimate for the area that includes Sarasota Bay out to Polk County is 1 million people food insecure. So if you had, half of that in Tampa Bay, that's not an unrealistic number.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting to know. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Gary. He's got the controls. Thank you, Noel.
Thank you, Noel.
All right. Thank you, everybody. You can see my screen. Been up for a while.
Yep.
Okay. This project came out of some discussions the TAC was having several years ago when Chris Kaufman was at the Water Management District, and we were starting on some of the hard bottom analysis work through a T-BRF grant. And so I'm building on the work that she's done and some folks from Charlotte Harbor. Thinking about the habitat suitability indexes in general, the idea is to take the best available data that you think will provide information to help identify those areas that are most suitable for habitat restoration, and in this case for oysters. And beyond using, we'll be using this as sharing this with our partners to identify those locations throughout the bay that are the most appropriate for oyster restoration. We'll probably be using it as a screening tool for different grants such as the T-BRF and the Bay Mini grants when they come into our office, at least to see if the folks applying for, and with an oyster restoration bent have been investigating the tools possible for appropriate siting of the different projects, and then also thinking about some of the bioremediation discussions that we're having up in Old Tampa Bay. This will help us hopefully locate oyster beds if it indicates that use of shellfish will be an appropriate action to help reduce the pyridinium issues that we're seeing up there. Like everything else, there's a lot of work that went into this. I said Chris Kaufman did some of the early background work, but to create this project, we had a lot of help. Water Atlas was the contractor. Keith Bornhorst, Rich Hammond, Sean Landry, and Adak Prasad from the USF Water Atlas. Steve West from Janicki Environmental produced a lot of the rasterized files for us, and then Ed and myself were working on it from the estuary program. So 3 main topics for this talk. I'll be talking about this habitat suitability index, going into it in some depth, trying to talk through how it was produced and showing you where it is live on the Water Atlas now. And then some brief information how we're working, how this is working through the Habitat Master Plan, being incorporated into the targets and goals that we've established for that. And then I'm going to talk about a session that we just did at the Restore America's Estuaries Coastal States Organization Summit based on Tampa Bay's oysters and trying to bring it into a larger perspective. So again, the question for a habitat suitability index of any type is where do we want to target restoration? And for this oyster HSI, it was heavily based on work that Jamie Boswell and some others did back in Charlotte Harbor, was produced in 2012. Essentially, we took a series of layers of data from multiple different partners, put them in a rasterized format, 10 by 10 meter grids, and produced a GIS model, combined all of these to identify those best locations throughout the system where we could do oyster restoration. And this website is live on the Water Atlas. It's the Tampa Bay Habitat Suitability Index. It's very easy to find if you actually just go to the Tampa Bay Water Atlas, the second tab, Discover. It's right here, Oyster Habitat Suitability. So it's pretty discoverable at this point. There's some background information on oysters, on our Habitat Suitability Index. I'll get to the map on the right in just a moment. It talks about why we're doing the Habitat Suitability Index, how it was made. I'm going to step through these different components of the model, depth, salinity, seagrass presence, absence, where the navigation channels are, and also silt clay percent. as the different components that went into the model. And continuing on down below, there's some summary of the data, and I'll walk through some of this information as well. Here are some links to the different original data sources and some background references. And then at the bottom of the screen, there are some more links and references that are useful towards oyster restoration for many different locations. Also, what's very nice about this is you can just press this hot button right here, and it'll give you a zip file of all the raster files that are involved in the GIS database. So, you know, it's very discoverable that we've opened this up. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible. I've actually already got the suitability map open on another screen, and this is so you've got the series of layers that are on the HSI, and I'm just going to walk through first the different components to the model. Like I said, the first consideration we used was depth. All of these layers were scored on a basis of 1 to 3, with 3 being the most desirable. The only exception was the channels. There's actually one elimination component for that. So oysters in Tampa Bay are generally intertidal, so are most suitable. Oysters are less than less than 0.9 meters, 3 feet. Least suitable in greater than about 2 meters or so. And so we utilize the USGS topography map to identify areas throughout the bay where these depths occurred. And then seagrass persistence, we don't want to do oyster restoration where we've got seagrasses. We're not going to destroy one important resource to create another one. So utilizing the SwiftMud data from 1988 on, if seagrasses were observed in an area more than 2 times over those biannual surveys, that was given the lowest score. If there was never any seagrasses observed in those systems, then they were that was considered the best possible situation. Then for salinity, Swanee Valetti down at FGCU did some estimations identifying higher salinity is needed to ensure that we have reduction of oyster diseases, MSX and dermo, within our populations in Southwest Florida. And so this is based on the amount of time that the salinity is over 2.5 PSU for any given location throughout the bay. And this took the EPC water quality data set and created isohalenes. And then during Chris Kaufman's work, she had done some analyses of where oysters exist within Tampa Bay, and identified that areas with silt clay percentages less than about 17.5% were where our oysters were most common. Above 23% were where they were least common. And so we have again binned it into those 3 components. And this is probably due to filtration capabilities, and also the fact that with those higher silt clays, the substrates will just sink into the sediments. The final piece that we used were channels. We're not going to be putting oysters in the major navigation channels or any ones that are maintained. And so those were actually completely omitted from the final model. We were basing our information on the Boswell work. So we had within 75 feet of the channel was considered moderately suboptimal. Outside of that 75-foot channel buffer was considered optimal. However, Dave Tomasco, through his ESA, and I think it was a contract with the Water Management District up in the Chassahowitzka, saying you may need a bit of a wider buffer. Again, this is a good first brush. You'll definitely need to go out and do field reconnaissance, work with the permitters to identify the appropriate locations. And then So all of these were simply added together to get final scores. The dark blue, the two blue shades are the areas that got either a perfect score, which is the very dark blue, or were tagged just for one issue. We think this provides a good set of locations for oyster restoration identification throughout Tampa Bay. These sites represent about 17,700 acres of potential restoration within the bay right now. So there's an enormous palette. About 7,600 acres of that would receive the perfect score. 10,000-ish acres receive the score of 14. So if we zoom in a little bit to the Manatee River here, and you can see going up the margins of the Manatee look like they'll be very appropriate for oyster restoration. This is one of the it will be an area we'll be working with on the next several years. I want to point out that there were some cutoff issues going up into the tributaries. For instance, going up into the Alafaya, there wasn't topobathy beyond this point, and then seagrasses information cut off about right here going south and up into the Braden River. However, given that this is identified as a really good potential location for oyster restoration, it'd be fairly safe to say that at least going up a little ways into the Braden River, you'll be able to continue oyster restoration. And then looking at the 2018 swift mud delineation, this is part of the seagrass work. They are identifying oyster beds and recognizing they have some issues with that as well. Up in the Braden River, just south of of where we're identifying this really good spots for oyster restoration, there are identified oyster beds. So this gives us some more confidence that just south of here are going to be more useful, potentially good locations for oysters. Okay, then again, we'll walk through the inclusive and exclusive layers. Again, these were all added together to get us to that series of scores. About 18,000 acres that were identified within entire Tampa Bay to be able to hone in for oyster restoration. Some of the best locations appear to be the saline portions of the tributaries and some of the upper embayments, especially around the mouths of different tributaries. As a applied researcher, always interested in getting more data regarding some of those upper tributary creeks and reaches, but I think that some of the nearby information, we have good data that will be able to show us where even beyond where we have complete data, where we'll be able to do some oyster restoration going forward. And thinking about this in the context of how we're going to plan for the future, the Water Management District, during their 2018 mapping, stated that about 171 acres of oyster beds are within Tampa Bay. Recognizing that there are a couple of issues with this, whether those are what the health of those beds are. We're also hiding oysters that are under mangroves or along seawalls, so it's missing some. But this is for all intents and purposes the best data that we have on oyster coverage in the system. And it also identifies, for me, areas that are fairly similar to where we will be focusing oyster restoration, so open areas, intertidal. Within the recently produced Habitat Master Plan update, we established a 2030 one decade target of 50 acres of restoration, so that would be added on top of that swift mud acreage, about 221 total. This puts us in context. It's actually a fairly aggressive target, seeing that our estimates are that about 15 acres of oysters have been restored since 2000, and then we're also doing a 2050 goal of 300 acres, and we'll be monitoring this within the up and coming Habitat Restoration Consortium that we'll be building out upon recommendation from the Habitat Master Plan, trying to track and monitor the different habitat restoration projects that are going on throughout the bay, both from a voluntary and a mitigation standpoint. And I see there's lots of questions coming in. I'll try to get to them at the end. I will get to them at the end. The last thing I'll talk about real quick was the session we just had at the Ray CSO Summit. It was Tampa Bay focused on oysters. Given that we're nationally, internationally known for our seagrass restoration efforts, I wanted to put forth, and with these great partners, some information on what we're doing very holistically, restoring oysters in the past and going forward. Damon Moore from Manatee County talked about the primarily about Manatee River, which actually back in the day was called the Oyster River, and the efforts that will be ongoing in that over the next several decades. Eric Plage from Tampa Bay Watch talked about their 20 years of work with multiple awesome volunteers, on locations throughout Tampa Bay, restoring oysters. And then Tom Rees from ESA provided an overview of how living shorelines are contributing to oyster restoration, whether through intentional or very happy accidents. Then we had our last couple of talks, and thinking about the talk that Tom and Kendall gave, getting some modern data, oyster information here. Scott Adams provided some information on a monitoring project that we're getting ready to wrap up, looking at restored and natural oyster reefs throughout Tampa Bay. And then Ed Sherwood from the Estuary Program provided an overview about the Habitat Suitability Index and the Habitat Master Plan, how we're integrating these to create new targets, new tools for improving our oyster restoration going forward. And so, that's about all I have. What's next? We're going to continue our oyster restoration. We're going to create more habitat. We know why we're doing it. There's a series of important ecosystem services that are provided by oysters. We have many different partners who are involved in this activity, always trying to find more. We've set up a pretty aggressive target for 2030 of 50 acres. And we're using this Habitat Suitability Index to help us identify where these different oyster restoration projects can go. And we'll be working through the Habitat Restoration Consortium to try and make sure that we're reaching these goals and targets. So thank you very much. Be glad to start taking questions.
You want to start with Tim? Do you want to weigh in on the fin sampling, your observations?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that where you drew the line in the Braden River, it goes, we've got oysters way past that. And just another thought I had after that is the fin program does record whether there's oysters along the shoreline. And that might be something that you could look at. It. Granted, it's just point data that would say there were oysters there, and we don't record whether they're alive or dead. But it might be able to expand your universe just a little bit if you just plotted our points that had oysters on them.
Yeah, and to that end, I was going to say, Tom also asked if you tapped into any of that tidal tributary study data to help better define those systems. So in terms of other data sets to pull from.
For the salinity and the sediment data, yeah, we used all available data sources. The limitations are definitely the seagrass layers and then the bathymetry layers, which is the reason why you see some of those cutoffs in the tributaries. So we don't have information from those other layers.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Exactly, Tim. That's why there was that line in the Braden River. It was because we were we started to lose data layers, and so we couldn't make a full analysis. But definitely recognize that the oysters go farther deep down, farther upstream in the Braden River.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and to follow up on the tidal tributaries, I mean, this I think is another good opportunity where we can marry those two different data sets, because we have information for every tidal tributary coming into the system of the relative health. And then, one of those categories is prioritize of things that could be needed for restoration. And so we could look at the tidal tributaries that need some love and the HSI output from that and see if there's opportunities to do those things together in terms of a biofiltration or bioremediation type approach. So I would just encourage us to think about those two different data sources and how we can use them playing off each other to plan restoration.
Chris, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. Great job, Gary. Looks awesome. I was just wondering about when you zoomed in on Manatee River, you can see deep blue in some of the residential canals. And so I was just wondering, based on those depths, and if there are boater access on those waters, if there's going to be any potential user conflicts, or if there's been any thought to maintaining channel navigation and interest by the community to put in oysters. So I was just wondering if you think realistically if those really will be restoration locations.
Well, definitely when there, if there's the potential, if there's a significant amount of boater traffic through any given location, that would be someplace that would drop off the table for oyster restoration unless there's an associated erosion problem that needs to be addressed, but that still wouldn't be done within the channels. And that's part, and again, this is, this is just that first this is that first stroke of looking at where you can potentially put those oysters. You still need to go out there and look and see where the boater use is, and see if there's some specific site conditions that aren't reflected in the model that would interfere with making that a good oyster restoration location.
There's some work that Dave Tomasco and ESA did for the Water Management District. He's like, oh, don't call on me. We're talking about some of the problems with ship wakes and how you probably wanted a larger buffer than what we're doing here.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about, Chris A. and I were just talking online about it. So we're planning on, we have a report, we're planning on publishing it. Chris is going to take the lead on it. And what we found is there's a big difference between exposure to waves, from like the Gulf of Mexico, is that the Crystal River and Homosassa River, versus waves that were due to like boat wakes. And I'm not sure why, but if it matched up pretty nicely with working in Indian River Lagoon. But like if I think our guidance was 200 feet, we basically did not find, we found oysters, but we didn't find living reefs within 200 feet of a boating channel. And I'm not sure why, but that was, and I'm not sure it's extrapolatable to Tampa Bay, but it was very straightforward in those two systems we looked at. So yeah, you could have the right salinity, you could have the right substrate, but you would not have living oyster reefs. You'd have collections of dead shells if you were within 200 feet of a boating channel. And it didn't seem to matter if you were like slow speed or not, because if you go boating a lot, you'll know that people who are in slow speed are actually producing larger wakes a lot of times because they're plowing through the water rather than displacing. But yeah, it was pretty strange. I don't know if it's applicable, but yeah, hopefully we can get that out.
Yeah, and it raised some questions for me, just because I know we've funded a couple of times, like going back towards places where we, tried to, use volunteers to build a reef, and then it didn't really take, and so we reinvest again. But we need to answer some of these questions before we continue to put our limited financial resources and, restoring oyster reefs where maybe they won't because of ship wakes or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason we did it for the Water Management District was because the thought that we were creating oyster reef habitats that weren't making it, because people didn't follow up to find out if that bag of oyster culch actually became a reef, and then if so, why not? So you may need to have wave attenuation before you have the oyster reefs that you thought were the wave attenuation in the first place.
Right, which is why some of Gary's oyster monitoring stuff is going to be great too. I have a long line of people who are waiting to talk, so I'm just going to keep calling on people, try to keep it structured. I see all itching to jump in. Gerald asked in the chat, why aren't there oysters in the priority HSI areas now, Gary?
Well, there actually are some. If you go back and look, oh, hi, Holly.
That was my question.
That was actually Holly's question.
Yeah, that was my question.
So there actually are some oysters in those priority areas. If you pulled off the prioritized locations and do some swiping with the layers, you'll see where there is some confluence of that. But again, I think a lot of these places are they're substrate limited. They don't have anything to grow on within those locations. And so if you thinking about all the wave impacts, if you put down either the raw shell or bag shell or oyster domes or something, that as long as there's that oyster spat in the water, there will be something that they can attach to and grow. And again, thinking about the fact that we have in this first brush, we have 17,000 acres that we can that are available, and you know,
Oh, we're losing you, Gary.
Lost his audio.
So, sorry, I lost audio for a second, it looks like, but I think we have a lot of opportunities to implement it.
And then Brian, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I don't know if this is what Marcus was talking about, maybe, but I'm just curious if there's any way to use the data. I think it's amazing. I mean, it's an incredible tool. Any of the criteria you were using or anything like that, is there anything that you could, or can we use the tool to, or is there some additive part that you could look at inland areas and how those inland areas are affecting some of your criteria to create more suitability?
Well, we can definitely.
He was talking about seawalls in his comment. So
that was the second part. Yeah. So then the second part was about if there was a way to overlay seawall locations. I don't know if that's documented in a program, but that was the second part. The first one is more like in terms of salinity or something like that. If we understood where there's concentrations or where that's affecting some of the oyster growth, is there a way to understand where inland factors are impacting the?
I think that, well, the answer is yes, and there's several people on the call who are much more informed about this than me. But thinking about the artificial structures that we have in the system, you know, there are potential ways to, you know, decrease salinity, but we also have to factor in, you know, our desires for maintaining low salinity areas for freshwater. Salt marshes going into the future, which require relatively low salinities. So there's some balancing acts, but we can definitely utilize, you know, minimum flow and level data, gauge information from multiple different partners to understand that. And then on the seawall, actually there were a lot of dead end canals, and I didn't really go into this in the talk. A lot of dead end canals were identified for potential oyster restoration locations, and scoring that 14 or 15. So, you know, making those living shoreline connections are absolutely critical as well.
And Brian, you might want to look at Michael Drexler's master's thesis from USF. He went around and quantified oyster growth on seawalls, just as FYI. Jessica.
Hey, well, I put it in there. Two things. One is I'm might be aware that Ann Birch with the Nature Conservancy is actually doing an oyster suitability index right now. And in fact, I think that their working group is having a meeting today at this time. And that's why Whitney Sheffield isn't on the call today. But don't know, I mean, Gary, have you chatted with Ann? Do you know if she's kind of been if you guys have been kind of coordinating? My recollection is she looked at the similar data layers. I didn't recall her seeing it do it in this. I mean, this is a beautiful format. I have another window open walking through that whole atlas as you were going through it, and it's super useful, and I love the way you can zoom in on areas. Do you know have you guys been chatting?
I recall a brief discussion with Ann at some point, but we haven't had any involved discussions, and you know, it's important. Like you say, it's important to ensure that these information sharing occurs, and that's, you know, like I said, we lifted a lot of this from Charlotte Harbor from 2012, and working with building on Chris Kaufman's work from a few years ago. But yeah, I'll try to get in touch.
Similarly with Mobile Bay, because, you know, with the Pensacola Perdido Estuary Program, we have representation from Alabama. And when TNC did a presentation on their oyster suitability index with to the estuary program committee, technical committee, some of the Alabama folks were really interested in doing that in some other areas of Alabama. So, you know, then again, making sure Mobile Bay is on board. The other question I had is, I mean, 17, almost 18,000 acres, and then a 50-acre goal. Like, I understand it's not just apples to apples, but I'm just wondering, I mean, that's a lot of real estate to potential look to hit those targets. Are there other limiting factors that say, oh, okay, well, man, I just look, there's dark blue everywhere. Oh, well, this is right off of, such and such. So no, that's really not. I mean, are there other factors? I mean, how are you going to narrow down where to target, where to get those 50 acres, given that you've got almost 18,000 to choose from?
Well, like I said, it's gonna be partner dependent. It's gonna be where their funding is coming from. What they think they can do. So different municipalities, largely the counties, are doing oyster restoration or living shoreline work, protecting parks or other public locations. I think there's a small. It'll have to be on a case-by-case basis. And thinking, was it Swanee Valetti? He actually said, okay, once you've done one of these habitat suitability for oyster analyses for oysters, you may ramp that back to about 10%. That may be your total maximum carrying capacity, and I don't think we're going to be able to get near that, even with because that would be still 1,700 acres or so. If we have a long way to go on it.
But I mean, it's great that it's like a blank canvas. I mean, not quite, but pretty cool.
And again, a lot of these sites, when you go out there and look at them, may get eliminated, like Chris was talking about. There may be unidentified private channels that are in there that we'd want to stay away from those. The Dave's point about increasing that the potential distance away from any channels to reduce the boat wake are also going to decrease that available pallet we have.
So I think Stacy had a question that I think we've responded to about considering channels and boat speeds. Dr. Placan had talked about how this would be useful for contextualizing some of their samples. I don't know if he wanted to extrapolate on that comment anymore, or.
No, well, not really. I just, it's going to be a great resource for us to think about how these, social formations in the past might have mapped onto some of these potential concentrations, or at least, suitable.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that offline with you, Tom. My worker, like Maya was saying, the Mike Drexler paper from about circa 2010 had some good oyster data in it as well.
And then adding to that, one thing that has been popping up in literature that I also found as well is a lot of, at least from the 1970s black and white area, what we found was that current mangrove islands were actually previous oyster locations. So you can look and say Old Tampa Bay, we've got some work on it. You look in Old Tampa Bay and you can see the white signature of an oyster reef in Old Tampa Bay, which you now look at it in current imagery, and they are mangrove islands. So we were seeing conversion to mangrove islands because of sediment accretion and the ability for them to colonize there. So potentially looking at some current mangrove islands as some of your historical relic sites could be an option as well.
Are hard to keep up with. There's a number of comments sort of about this idea about natural oyster expansion, and some observations of that occurring in Cross Bayou and whether or not anybody's tracking it. This ongoing conversation about sort of what the maps are missing and how we know that oysters on red mangrove crop roots are, pretty significant. And I know that Chris is also weighing in, Chris Anastasio is also weighing in about what the district's mapping doesn't capture, also in terms of like this question that's been lingering about live dead oysters. I don't know, who wants to chime in? You're all kind of talking around the same stuff.
One thing I will chime in for to address Chris's concept of mangrove is one thing that we weren't able to include. We tried, but I don't think Gary was able to carry it forward, was to address oysters and mangroves, was to include the shoreline extent of the land use of mangroves into the model. So if we know where the current mangrove shorelines are in Tampa Bay, and we know that the mangrove and the oysters carry in about 6 inches into that, to try to create an aerial cover of the potential habitat of prop roots that the oysters could grow on, and try to include that in a habitat suitability index. I don't think it was carried forward. It was kind of complicated. I didn't get very far with it, but that was one idea.
We did not use that in the model, Chris. That's correct. But yeah, recognize that the oysters growing in the mangroves are a significant component. And with the monitoring project that we're doing right now with FWRI and Tampa Bay Watch, we are looking at some, not a whole, I think 3 or 4 natural reefs around Tampa Bay, and so we'll be able to get some ideas if those. Need to go back and double check that those are capped. I'm pretty sure we identified them through the district map. So those oyster reefs will be on the district, hopefully on the 2020. They were definitely on the 2018 oyster seagrass maps, and so we'll be able to make a similar statement to what Dave had from the Chasowitska, that about the percent live dead sizes on these different oyster reefs, on these quote unquote natural oyster reefs that are somewhere, a few of them that are in the system. And I think to Stacy's question, as someone tracking natural oyster expansion, the best information that we have is the district biannual maps as part of the seagrasses. And I don't know if they're Dave or Aaron, do you think those will be actually Chris A or Aaron? I wonder if those will be able to look at those relatively micro changes.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly take a look at that. I mean, the imagery will be available, and I think that's a good, that's a really good value add to the maps themselves, is to look at those areas on a finer scale.
I know there's a lot of interest around this topic, but we do need to get moving on. We have 2 more presentations today, so hopefully this is something that the conversation will continue at the Habitat Restoration Consortium that Gary teased, and so stay tuned. Jeff, I've handed the presenter controls over to you. Are you able to get that working, or do you need a little this?
How's that?
Perfect.
Can you see the screen?
Yes,
yep.
we can.
Okay, all right.
Your voice is a little quiet.
What was that?
I was just saying your voice is a little quiet.
Okay, let me see if I can turn that up for you. So we're doing a project right now. We've been working on it for about 5 years. It's a property that was in the city of Palmetto on the Manatee River. And by the way, the Damon Moore presentation on the Oyster River is a very good presentation. I've lived here all my life and did not know that it was called the Oyster River. And his pictures of Manatee Avenue in Braden and being lined with oysters out of the river, and the damage that it showed was quite enlightening for somebody that's, like I said, been here all his life and didn't understand that. So Connor Park is a see if we can get this going. There we go. Is named after a gentleman by the name of Francis Connor, and we've been trying for the last 4 or 5 years to do things with the redevelopment agency in a sustainable development type manner, modeled after Barbier 1983, I think, with the social, environmental, and economic bin chart. And we've had a lot of success with SwiftMud, and we're happy to be partnered with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program on this project. And Francis Connor is a part of our history. He was an agriculturalist from Clemson, and he basically was helping farmers at that time learn how to process and pack their agricultural products via train. And this piece of property was actually owned by the train line, the rail line, all the way back when it was like the Tampa rail line. And I found an 1870 plat map that showed that it was actually a bayou until the railroad came in with large pieces of granite, formed the barrier of the land, and then dredged out a channel around it and filled it in so they could make a landing for their railroad on the north side of the Manatee River. So it was actually not land, but created land. And I guess that was prior to being able, I'm sure it'd be interesting to see if they could actually pull that off today. So in the process of this land being created, the city of Palmetto, back prior to them having a wastewater treatment facility, would dump their solid waste or their waste into the river. And this is where they did this, and it was everything. It was, you name it. It was human waste and anything else. They just dumped it into the river right there. So in the process of not only the railroad and the city of Palmetto, and to the north is a tomato packing plant that used to dump their wash water in at this point, they created a brownfield site. In fact, it was such a brownfield site that it was on the state of Florida's list of prior to being a brownfield site under CERCLA. It was on their list, and the city of Palmetto purchased the land without doing any type of environmental right around 2000, and ended up becoming the entity that was responsible for the pollutants. They've been dealing with FDR and then FDP, EP, and they never could quite get it off the list. So we took it from them a few years ago and ran it through the brownfield program. And what makes this site, I mean, this is all interesting information, but what makes this site interesting is that it's actually been identified as a brownfield site. It's in the program with the state. It received EPA grant funding for remediation, and our final use is to partner with the SwiftMud and the Tampa Bay Estuary Program to create a stormwater pretreatment for 70 acres of upland land to remove pollutants and nitrogens from the stormwater prior to going into the river. So it has that historic value to it for us. It has the environmental value and the social value, and also helping to create a habitat using some interesting technology. We're hoping to create a better river so that it can be used and make it more economic. So it also has been designated as part of our linear trail system, which goes to the city. It's one of the locations that we use. So as far as the identification with Tampa Bay Estuary, the Environmental Restoration Fund, we're receiving $50,000 that we're matching. And this is money that's separate from anything we're doing with SwiftMud, in case anybody from SwiftMud is online, because Nicole has taught me to say that. She scares me sometimes. And the part of the money is being used to work with USF to do a survey of the citizens of Palmetto about Connor Park and to create information that will be in the park. It will be developed as videos that will be QR coded onto the signs, and so that when you walk through the park, you can learn about everything from the history, why the park is named the way it is, all the environmental concepts that are built into the park, and the restoration itself. So And as far as we know in the state of Florida, this is the first identified circular/brownfield designated site that's been turned into a stormwater pretreatment, and on top of that layered with a park and trail. It will incorporate as part of the Environmental Restoration Fund reef ball technology from Sarasota that we've used in the past. I'll show you some pictures of that in a second, to basically create an inverted living shoreline. And so when the water does flow in and out, because it is tidal, we'll be able to increase the critters that go on these reef balls. And I was one of the biggest skeptics of this type of process until we did it ourselves, and the results have been anecdotally quite amazing. So to give you an idea, we've done this type of work before. About 7 years ago, we created MLK Park, which is on the Car Drain. It does collect stormwater and pre-treats it prior to it going back into the drain and then into the river. And that's located about, I'd say about a quarter mile from the outfall of this new project we're working on, which, by the way, the brownfield we're working with, we work with Cardno and Miles Baylog, who's one of the best in the state when it comes to brownfields, and Eli Araj from Applied Sciences. He does all of our stormwater work and is one of the sharpest guys when it comes to low impact development. In fact, in this picture, you see the construction of the park going on, and that pavilion up along that pond is actually all low impact development. We use storm pavers and bioswales, and we've put in about 44,000 square feet so far in the CRA. And in the next 5 years, we'll add at least another 100,000 with a complete street we're working with FDOT, hopefully SwiftMud and the State Revolving Loan Fund. And we'd like to come back to Tampa Bay Estuary and ask for help with that again. This is Riverside Park, which is about 200 feet to the west of the outfall of the project we're talking. And the reason I show you this picture is because all those parking spaces, this is an FDOT project we did with SwiftMud. All the parking spaces you see there are low impact development. Those are bioswales that are collecting stormwater at that, and that long trail that you see that it's also on our trail system, but all of that is low impact development, storm pavers also. Underneath all of that is catch space made by aggregate, compressed aggregate, and some lining that does collect the stormwater as it comes down. And these are the reef balls that we talk about. We haven't used reef balls just as reef balls along this Riverside Park. There's about 1,700 linear feet of what we call a living seawall. We have an existing, we put in a brand new seawall, but right off of it, we laid these tiered reef balls, and they're up to 3 levels of the tiered. And like I said, when I found out that we could partner with SwiftMud to create this, I was very skeptical of it. I didn't, okay, so we'll put this in the water. It's amazing what this has done, and it's converted my whole mindset when it comes to this type of project. The barnacles show up, then the oysters show up, then the fish show up, and then the bigger fish show up. For years, nobody has fished along that seawall, and now that seawall has fishermen all along it most of the time. So this was a brand new idea and product with the folks at the Reef Ball Foundation, and I know Sarasota has followed suit. The new park that we're proposing, Connor Park, will just use the reef ball technology by itself. We won't be creating a tiered system. So this is the property we're talking about, and it's right next to the railroad. The railroad used to put their ties on this property. So, creosote, arsenic, so many pollutants in the environmental too that we discovered that it was, I could name them. I don't know what they are. I can barely pronounce their names. But this piece of property has really been a sore spot for the city. And like I said, the CRA took it over. We've run it through we've done 5 brownfields in the last 5 years, gas stations, you name it, with a hardware store that we purchased, we're remediating. In the state of Florida, the Brownfield statute and the CRA statute are tied together by the legislature. You can create brownfields in CRAs quicker than any other place in the state of Florida. They lowered the requirements. In fact, our entire CRA is a brownfield area. We don't call it that. We call it an economic enhancement zone. But this is what I just took this from one of the designs off the bid package, and as you can see, we're going to create a nice size pre-treatment pond. It's going to collect water from 2 different locations, one to the north, one to the south, and on top of that, we're going to layer park elements. This is what it will look like when it's completed, and it will include solar trees, trying to take the city commissioners, who also are a CRA board, into a new kind of solar farming, urban solar farming, where we actually include solar trees into the urban landscape, as try and make it as natural as possible, and then tie that into the grid. FP&L's got a great new financing program that I think I can talk them into. And if you see in the lower left-hand corner, it says the Calusa shell mound. Well, on this site, there was no shell mound. We've been talking about shell mounds all morning, but what we thought we would do is create some simulated shell mounds, because the Calusa Native American tribe was there in this area, and we've got 2 mounds, natural mounds, within a mile of this location. And what this is all that parking you see there, all the red that you see there, that's all stormwater pavers, using bioswales, putting a pavilion there. It's right on the river. This piece of property has just sat vacant, and this is our attempt to give it a layered life that's both environmental and social, so that you can use it, and even economic, because the more, as you'll see in the survey, the more projects we do like this makes the city a more desirable place to live, and hopefully will have an effect on average immediate incomes over time. There is a natural wetland, so it is like a 3-tiered system of filtering. And once the water goes through the bioswales and the LID, then it goes into the actual pond, and then it overflows into a natural wetlands area, then goes into the river. So this is what it will look like. This is what it looks like now. And we have a lot of dirt to remove. To give you an idea on the cost, Swiftmud's putting in $600,000. They put in $100,000 for planning for us. We only asked the Tampa Estuary for $50,000 because this is the first time we've asked them for money, and we wanted to be very careful to make sure we do everything right. And then the rest of it comes from the CRA, which we're putting $2.5 million into it. Not most of that, probably a good $750,000 we'll receive back through the Brownfield program in tax credits. Any money we spend on remediation, we can get up to 75% back in state tax credits, which we've been collecting over the years for other projects. And we've even collected tax credits off of the EPA grant that we received. So out of the $200,000 that we used so far for remediation, we've already applied for and we'll receive back probably about $150,000. And that's one of the few places you can get federal money, use it, and turn around and get state money back on top of it. So, and I did check with both the Brownfield folks and the EPA at a Brownfield conference just to make sure that was okay, because it sounds good, but it was still, I had to get somebody to tell me it was okay. So this is the actual USF part of the presentation. Dr. Al Sharif couldn't be here today. We were trying to get him on board to do this part. This is his part of it that we have funded. And basically, these are the folks that worked on the survey. This was a door-to-door survey. That's Professor Al Sharif on the left, and this is Dr. Michael Edifel, who has actually graduated with his PhD and now at Townsend College. And Nicole Tremblay was a graduate student in the Masters in Urban and Regional Planning at USF. graduated, was working as an intern for me, and now she's working for the City of Venice, planning and zoning. So this was the method. They went door to door and they went to different festivals in the city of Palmetto during the spring. We couldn't do this now because of COVID. And it was done with USF faculty and students. It was approved by the IRB at USF, the Institutional Review Board, and they did it. They collected 61 surveys total. There were 24 questions, and the questions really focused on how would people would they use the park, their perception of water quality, and understanding of brownfield restoration efforts, and also the demographics of the participants. So what Dr. Al-Sharif has done is he's put together some pie charts and to get to understand who these folks were and what they felt about these topics. So as you can see here, the majority of folks have lived in the city for, and this was all within the city limits, for 10 years or more. Also, most of them own their location where they live. And their perception of water quality in Manatee County, they basically, the majority of folks feel, almost 50% feel that there's really has been no change in the water quality. And let's not forget that this is kind of in the aftermath of red tide and some other things. So there's probably a stigmatic effect because of that. The distance from the park where they live, and the majority of folks say they live within 1 or 2 miles. The average of the city of Palmetto is about 6 square miles, so most of the folks do live within range of the park. And the suggested facilities of the park, which what they saw, the largest number, as you see, is a walking trail, which is included in the park. A lot of the walking trail through the downtown, through the CRA itself, we have been building and using all low impact development. This is a new complete street that we're looking at on 10th Avenue, which is 14 blocks. It will all be low impact development, mostly paid for by FDOT and a loan from the State Revolving Loan Fund, which is a 20-year 0% right now loan that we can get as a CRA. And use our tax increment financing as leverage. They would also like to see playgrounds, rest areas, bicycle pedestrian paths, and some of those we have included in this, and some of those are in other parks that are attached to this. So, do the residents agree with the conversion of a brownfield to a public park? And this is a question that you figure most folks don't really think about very often. But 74% said yes. And the fact that this piece of property is fronted right on the river, so a beautiful view. The railroad still uses that line, so from time to time you do get the railroad going through. But for people like me that have always lived there, it's kind of the character of the city that on Saturday mornings at about 8 or 9 o'clock, the Tropicana train is going to run through town and you're going to hear it. So to me, that's kind of nice. So the importance of the restoration project, as you can see, the vast majority of folks from moderately important to extremely important, they agree that this is an important project for us to do. Not only because it gets the city off the hook as far as their liability with the EPA or FDEP, but because I really do believe folks have an appreciation for environmentally enhancing, especially when you've got a negative like a brownfield, to reverse that, turn it into a positive. So, and then also on top of that, layer it with park amenities. Future utilization of the park, will you use it if they build it? I guess that's the old from the movie. And people are extremely likely or somewhat likely or just about 90%. So, we will spend this money and tying it so that people can actually use mobile facilities to get to it. Hopefully, we're starting to see a change in the city's philosophy when it comes to transportation and amenities for the residents. activities to pursue after the construction of the park, and just a wide array, but the most, the biggest two are walking and just relaxing and hanging out. And we've tried to create some vertical amenities in the park. The trail that runs through it is actually elevated over the water so that you can look over the mangroves and see the Manatee River and the Bradenton skyline from the other side. We wanted to make sure that we took advantage as much as possible of anything we could. We've also talked about including bat houses to reduce mosquitoes and things like that. That one's still, the coronavirus, I think that one may be on hold, but we are still looking to include the solar trees, and also in a certain part of the park where we actually do have a little bit of a slope. We are putting in a very short, because it's Florida, little waterfall. So just trying to add that water feature and the sound of the water over the rocks as you walk by to kind of give it a very peaceful feel. Satisfaction levels of the project failing to be completed. And as you can see, about 78% of the people said they would be either somewhat dissatisfied or extremely dissatisfied. The good news is the plans have all been completed, and we are currently in the process of bidding them out. We're behind schedule because of COVID, but everybody has been a little thoughtful about that, especially SwiftMud. They offered to give us an extension because of what was going on. Right now, we're getting ready to put it out and get the bid back in so we can get the contractor up and running. And the first thing is to remove that dirt that we have to take to, I think, Ocala to have it dealt with, because any dirt that's on this site is going to be deemed as contaminated. Satisfaction that the project won't be completed on time. This survey was done prior to COVID, so a lot of folks said they would be disappointed if it wasn't done on time. Hopefully they have a slightly different opinion now, because they probably aren't even thinking about it. They're too busy thinking about the election. So reasons for visiting other parks. This is in comparison. We do have other parks in the city, and we have been creating new ones. Depending on the location and the amenities and how clean the park is. So that was one of the things that the CRA also is addressing, is maintenance of the parks that we create, taking them to a higher level than what the rest of the city receives. It's very frustrating when you create a beautiful low impact development area and then the maintenance on it fails and plants die because the reuse water was connected, but then they turned it off for whatever reason. And so we've taken over the maintenance of our own parks. Distance respondents are willing to travel to this park. And as you can see, 22% said they would travel 5 miles or more. But the good news is that it shouldn't be more than a 2-mile connection. And hopefully, if we have the trail system in place, they can either bike or walk and not only walk to this park, but walk through other parks that we have and into our downtown, which creates that economic energy that we're also looking for. So controlling stormwater impacts on the Manatee River and Tampa Bay estuary. And as you can see, these are some of the ideas that we put in front of the folks. And the biggest one was, nitrogen friendly and native plants, which are included in the bioswales and in the pond to help absorb some of that. Low impact development was at 18%. Removal of invasive species, that area that we have that's already natural, that is a wetland. We will be going in as part of this and removing Brazilian peppers as best we can, and any other invasive species that are there as far as that's concerned. And we've really had a great relationship with SwiftMud, because we do have a number of parks that have had Brazilian peppers in them. And from time to time, SwiftMud will just show up with some extra funding they had, and we'll go in and just tear out Brazilian peppers. They'll just tell us they're showing up, and it's always good to see them when they do that. Yeah, this is probably one of the most interesting slides that he had, and this one was what's the perceived sources of pollution in the Manatee River, and as you can see, 24% is urban runoff, and okay, so that's stormwater. It's water being picked up on the road from cars, and then flushing through the system into the river. That one I get. Fertilizer, you name it. 18% is industrial. Okay, and we do have agricultural facilities that are deemed industrial. And in the past, they have just let their wash water flow right into the storm system. That's changed. The one that's interesting to me is wastewater leaking from septic tanks at 17%. We haven't had septic tanks in the city for decades because of money we received a long time ago to build a Class 1 treatment plant, Bardfo treatment plant. And that's an interesting one because there shouldn't be any septic tanks in the city limits. Now, outside the city limits, Manatee County has done a great job, but there still are some locations like Sneed Island, where I live, that are still on septic tanks. So, and maybe that's where that perception comes from. Golf courses is another high one, and as we all know, golf courses are slowly devolving. I mean, they're just not as popular as they used to be. Millennials don't seem to play golf as much, I guess, and most golf courses are being rehabilitated back into housing. So residents rating about various technologies and abilities to enhance the water quality. So what they think about things like low impact development, urban gardens, and retention ponds. And as you can see, that they feel that all three of those are very important for the most part. If you look at the extremely important, very important, and the moderately important, that's the vast majority of what they feel about this. So we're really excited that they feel this way because it really says something about the parks that we want to create and continue to create, and more of the low impact development. One of the reasons we like the low impact development is because it matches with the traditional look of the city, and especially the red pavers, and they are expensive, but we have found ways to just put a capital stack together to help pay for that, helping with partners like SwiftMud and FDOT. It adds to the aesthetics of the downtown of the city itself. Age distribution of the respondents, the vast majority of them were 55 to 64, which puts them in the young boomer age. And then you can just kind of see where it goes from there. In conclusion, it indicates that most respondents have a good grasp of water quality in the county. And I can relate that a good portion of that comes from Manatee County, comes from guys like Damon Moore, because if you've ever heard him speak, his energy about speaking about the Oyster River, you just want to go out and start putting oysters in the water after you listen to them. They'd like to see the park develop into a walking trail, and that's something that not only we are doing, but we have planned to do that for years, and we've been building that trail for the better part of a decade now. And then, in fact, we just applied for a second time and didn't get a build grant, partnering with Manatee County and FDOT for the Palmetto Trails. We'll get there sooner or later with that. Many believe that the brownfield site should be converted into a park, and they indicate that it's extremely important to very important. The idea, we've looked around and we couldn't find a site like this in Florida that was funded through EPA and through the brownfield programs and through the whatever water management district or the state revolving loan fund, or anybody like Tampa Bay Estuary. We did find one, I think, in North Carolina. So this is something that was new to us, and as a member of the Brownfield Association, this is something they were talking about that we were planning. So has it been easy? Absolutely not. It's funny, the brownfield program and the water management part of it, all of that falls under FDEP, but dealing with them separately, that's almost like dealing with two different entities all together. So it hasn't been quite that easy, but we're working through it, and we're really excited that we're getting ready to start construction. So most respondents indicate they would use the park for different activities, and a significant majority would be extremely dissatisfied or somewhat dissatisfied if the park was not completed. So even with COVID, we're moving forward with the park. The money's been budgeted on our part, and we've been relying on the grace of the Tampa Bay estuary and the Swift Mud for their patience, and we're very grateful for that. Finally, most respondents have a good knowledge of how to reduce the impacts of urban runoff, and we went through that and all the different things that they mentioned and how they rated them. So we also feel that we've been kind of training our folks in the city prior to this with some of the other low impact development things that we've done. A lot of them are parks, and they do get to see that. So one of the things that we are pushing for, that we are working on, is on the signage. Like I said, we're working with a videographer to create videos of the construction and the meaning of the parks and what the layering is, so that when you go out there with your cell phone, you can hit that QR code and you can actually learn. And USF that's part of the agreement we have with them, is to help us with that content. So that's my presentation. This is the seahorse, which is a tip of the hat to a seahorse that used to exist at that same location when I was a kid. It was part of a very kitsch tourist site on US 41 at the Manatee River. They had alligators, free orange juice, and every night the owner would come out and milk rattlesnakes in the parking lot with anybody circled around him that wanted to see him do it. Try and do that today. What you see at the bottom of the seahorse, it's almost 40 feet tall with the base, and at the bottom are the reef balls that we use along the waterfront, which is just right behind this. So, and all of that is also low impact development. So, you know, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'm very thankful that you guys gave me the time to give this presentation. Hopefully the next time we see you, we will have a ribbon cutting that we will have Tampa Bay Estuary come to and help us open up the Connor Park. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. All right, so our final presentation today is from Gerald Morrison, who is going to be updating us on the WASP model. Maya, are you passing control over?
Yes. So thanks, Jeff, for that talk. We have to make enough time so that Gerald can get through his too. So if anyone has any questions for Jeff, I can connect you up with him via email, or you can chat with him directly. But we look forward to seeing what comes out of this project. We're excited about it. Ready, Gerald?
Yep, I think so. Here, let's see. Slideshow from beginning. Can you guys see and hear okay?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay, great. This is a project that Tim Wool and James Martin and I have been working on lately, and we thought we finally had gotten to the point of having some results that might be of interest to the estuary program and to the TAC. James and I are both retired, and Tim works with EPA Region 4 in Atlanta. And this is actually an update of a project that we worked together on along with several other folks back in the mid-1990s. And that applied the EPA WASP water quality model to Tampa Bay using the version of the WASP code that was available then, which was version 4. And that simulated water quality in the Bay for the years 1985 through 1994. And that project generated a couple of reports. If anybody's interested in background reading on it, these are both available as PDFs. And the current project, we're updating and simulating water quality, added 2 additional decades. So we're covering the years 1985 through 2016. And we're using the current version of the WASP code now, which is version 8. But otherwise, we're trying to keep the model as similar as possible to the original. And you'll see why here in a minute. And there's a draft report that was, I think, whoops, what's that? available from the as part of the agenda today, is downloadable from the TBEP website. Just some background on the model. WASP is it's a public domain water quality simulation model that's supported by EPA and can be downloaded from the EPA website. The original application to Tampa Bay included only 8 state variables, and they're numbered here on the little diagram, in 4 interacting systems. That's phytoplankton, nitrogen, phosphorus, and dissolved oxygen. So by today's standards, this is a very, very simple water quality model, almost simplistic. In terms of segmentation, the original model covered all 7 of the segments of the bay, but back then, the only data sets that were available for model calibration and testing was the EPC monitoring data, which was restricted to the 4 main stem bay segments. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. And there, in terms of model segments, those are shown over on the right side. There are 3 model segments in Old Tampa Bay, 2 in Hillsborough Bay, excuse me, 3 in Middle Tampa Bay, and 2 in Lower Tampa Bay. And in order to get the model up and running, there's a certain amount of user-provided input that needs to be made available to it. So a big piece of it is just the physical characteristics of the model segments, estimated external loads and boundary conditions, and the loads, of course, we get from the estuary program annual loading estimates. Meteorological data, so we've got you know, solar irradiance, that sort of thing. And the portrait here is me trying to input 30 years worth of hourly meteorological data into the WASP input file. So that's what this kind of stuff does to you. And also for WASP 4, a number of other things that had to be incorporated in the model or put in as input were values of the various rate constants and coefficients for all the biochemical processes involved. And also, we had to estimate during calibration what the sediment nutrient exchange rate or nutrient release rates from the sediments and sediment oxygen demand were. And so that's something that we estimated through the calibration process, and we're providing to the model as input. And we'll be coming back to that over and over and over again in this presentation. In terms of model outputs, it generates things like time series of the various the variables that are being predicted, the simulations for salinity and all those things, predicted factors that the model believes are limiting for phytoplankton growth, and summaries of internal and external sources and sinks of some of the important parameters, which are very helpful for tracking and reporting purposes. So some key predictions from the original version of the model were that phytoplankton growth rates in Tampa Bay are limited primarily by light and also by bioavailable nitrogen. And then the second one, if external nitrogen loads are increased, then phytoplankton growth rates and biomass will tend to increase also. And although those external loads are the source of new nitrogen to the bay, the model believes that it's internal recycling of nitrogen that drives more than half of the phytoplankton production each year, and that's due to the high flux rates of those internal processes. And those are driven primarily by decomposition of organic matter and mineralization of organic nitrogen and phosphorus back to inorganic forms that can be taken up by living phytoplankton, and that occurs primarily in the sediments. And so that gets back to the point before. The WASP-4 version of the model wasn't able to simulate those sediment-related processes. That wasn't added into the model until the mid-2000s. That was a tough nut to crack for the modelers, and most general-purpose water quality models didn't include those sediment processes until sometime in the 2000s. So in the original model, the sediment nutrient flux rates and sediment oxygen demand were estimated during the calibration process and provided to the model as estimated input. And that's a very important limitation that caused quite a bit of concern back when we were working on the original project. And the reason for that concern is that everyone knew that if the bay were to experience sustained increases or decreases external nutrient loads, then the amount of organic matter being deposited to the sediments would show similar trends, and that would change the amount of organic matter that's available for decomposition, which in turn would change the fluxes of recycled inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus being released back to the water column. And we know that if those changes occur, the model can't simulate them, because we've told the model that those fluxes can vary seasonally and between bay segments, but they don't change from year to year. So we knew at the time that a model based on the WAS4 code wouldn't be able to simulate long-term sediment-related changes in water column N and P concentrations of the sort that you would expect to see if there were sustained increases or decreases in external loads. And of course, we know one of the major things that's happened in Tampa Bay over the last 40 years is that there have been some large changes, large declines in the external loads. Total nitrogen loads in particular fell very sharply between the mid-70s and the mid-80s, and the WAS models picked up in the mid-80s. That's when it started its simulation. Since then, the total nitrogen loads have been fluctuating from year to year, but there's no real evident trend there. Phosphorus showed a different pattern. It did not fall as sharply prior to the mid-80s, but it's continued falling since then. And overall, on a percentage basis, the reduction in total phosphorus loads since the mid-70s has actually been larger than the reduction in nitrogen loads on a percentage basis. So that's what led us to, in this phase of the update, to really focus on looking at the model's skill, that is its ability to simulate what's going on in the bay. And we're most interested to see what would happen, if we add 2 decades to the time series of the simulation. How does the model hold up given those issues we just talked about? And so we're using a combination of graphics and metrics to look at model skill, which we're defining as goodness of fit between the model's predictions and the measured values reported by the EPC monitoring data. And this is for the entire 1985 to 2016 period. And we'll be focusing on just a handful of the major water quality constituents today. And the graphics we're looking at are things like time series of the observed and predicted values and empirical CDFs and side-by-side box and whisker plots, that sort of thing. And the metrics include a group that are widely used for this sort of model skill assessment. And the one that we'll be focusing on most today is one called absolute percent bias. And here's how that's calculated. Here the O sub i's and the S sub i's are the observed and simulated values of a given water quality constituent in a given model segment in a given month. So we have 30 years of monthly observed and predicted values in those 10 model segments. So we've got a lot of data points to look at. And the absolute percent bias is the sum of the absolute values of the difference between the simulated and observed values. And that's scaled to the sum of the observed values and then expressed as a percentage. So it's a helpful index. And one of the most helpful things about it is that it's been used widely enough that you can actually use the scores, the values that you calculate, as a way of grading the model's skill. And so scores less than 10 are considered excellent, 10 to 20 are very good, 20 to 40 good, greater than 40 poor. So that's a very handy aspect of that. And so looking at on a bay-wide basis for the updated WAS model for the years 1985 through 2016, we get the following scores for model skill. It's graded as being excellent for salinity all the way down to poor for total phosphorus. And this is actually good news from a bay manager's point of view, because the parameters we're most interested in are things like dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll A, total nitrogen, reflecting bay trophic state. And the model is still doing a reasonably good job with those, even over this extended time period. Total phosphorus, the model says, is not limiting in the bay, so the fact that it's doing a poor job with that really doesn't hurt its ability to simulate trophic state conditions in the bay. But from a modeling point of view, the fact that you're getting a poor score on a major parameter like this tells you that you've got a problem that needs to be addressed. So these are just some of the graphical ways of looking at the results, and I'll show you the one for salinity that was the excellent set of simulations, and then total phosphorus, which was the poor. We're looking at predicted versus observed salinity values. So each one of these is a monthly value over that 30-year period. And the points are all nicely clustered near the 1-to-1 line, where the predicted values are equal to the observed. And if you do a regression line, the red line through this thing, it's that line fits pretty nicely on top of almost on top of the 1-to-1 line. The empirical CDFs match up very well, and the side-by-side box plots match up very well in terms of the predicted values and the observed values having a similar range of minimum to maximum values, 25th to 75th percentile values, and the medians match up really well. So if we could get these kinds of results for every one of the model parameters, we would be quite happy. But total phosphorus is a whole different story. The predicted versus observed, the points really aren't very tightly matched to the 1-to-1 line. There's quite a bit of gap between the empirical CDFs for the predicted and observed values. Side-by-side box plots look pretty horrible. And in fact, the median of the predicted values is greater than the 75th percentile of the observed. So this really is poor. And to look at what's going on here, it's helpful to look at the observed and predicted model predicted values for total nitrogen in the top graph and total phosphorus in the bottom, and focus first on the predicted values, the green bars. And you'll see that for both nitrogen and phosphorus, those predicted values are fluctuating up and down from year to year, but they don't show any trend. And presumably that's because of that issue we talked about, that the model really isn't able to simulate the fluxes coming out of the sediments. So all it knows are the changing external loads. And then when you look at the observed concentrations, particularly for phosphorus, there's been a pretty substantial decline in those concentrations in the bay that the model just can't pick up. And there's sort of a tendency in that direction for nitrogen, but it's not so severe that it's really dinged the model's skill assessment score yet for nitrogen. But for phosphorus, you can see just how off the model is in the last couple of decades. So some take-home messages then at this point is that the ability of the model to simulate changes in sediment nutrient fluxes does appear to be an important limitation. And that's a good news and a bad news story. The good news is that the current version of WASP 8, includes what's called a sediment diagenesis module, and that can be turned on and used to simulate those changing sediment nutrient fluxes. The bad news is that for Tampa Bay, we really don't have the data that are needed to parameterize and calibrate the model for that module. So if we were to go ahead and do that without the needed data, the modeling process would basically be a parameter tuning exercise, which can be informative and the modelers enjoy it, but from a resource management perspective, it's not the optimal way to be modeling these kinds of things. So in terms of potential next steps, we would suggest that the TBEP and the TAC might wish to consider a multi-pronged approach. The first one being to collect those data so that we have a better understanding of these sediment-related processes. One key would be the things directly related to sediment diagenesis. Another is a little bit from left field, but back in the early 2000s, some folks in the local USGS office did some really interesting work on something that's called submarine groundwater discharge, or also known as the subterranean estuary. And it's suggested that there may be some really large nutrient fluxes coming into the bay, and it's not new nitrogen or phosphorus, it's recycled, but it's more of an advective process than the sediment diagenesis is, that's more diffusive. So there could be some very large annual fluxes of nitrogen and phosphorus going from the sediments to the water column through this pathway, and we just don't know. The work that was done in the early 2000s, it was when this whole field was in a very immature state, or very young. There's been a lot done since then, and it'd be really interesting, I think, to revisit this issue. and also data on some other sediment related processes could be helpful. And then as an interim measure, possibly, while working on collecting that data from step one, we could go back, or anyone could go back and recalibrate the existing WASP model for the most recent 2 decades in that simulation period, 95 through 2004, 2005 to 2016. And if we, just by recalibrating the sediment nutrient flux portions of that model, it might dramatically improve model skill, not only for phosphorus, but also perhaps for nitrogen chlorophyll DO, which could make it more valuable as a bay management tool. And then as another possible interim measure, even though the data aren't available yet, we could use the current version of WASP 8 with that sediment diagenesis module turned on, use that, simulate water quality over the entire 85 to 2016 period, and then use the model's predictions as hypotheses that could be tested as the field data from step number 1 are being collected. And also that could be helpful to say, okay, from the model's point of view, how much additional flux does it think it needs, and what portion of those fluxes are being actually produced by some of these different processes. Like that might be an interesting exercise. So thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it. My email address is here. I'll be happy to answer any questions if we have time here. We'll greatly appreciate comments on the draft report. And if we don't have time to talk about it today, here's my email address, and please contact me offline. I'll be happy to talk about these things. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We have just a minute or two. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Dave.
Hey, Gerald, I thought that was really pretty neat. And I was kind of wondering, I obviously don't speak for anyone with the estuary program, but I was kind of thinking, are there parts of Tampa Bay where the empirical modeling approach is not working all that well, where it might be worth looking at something and coupling that with, would this be a better tool in areas with long residence time where internal loads would be, stronger? And the reason why I was bringing that up is I remember in Rogers on this call, I think, Rogers' original, Hillsborough Bay loading model, he had to have like a 3-year time lag before he could find empirical.
Even a 5-year lag, yeah.
Yeah, so I was kind of thinking, I'm thinking in Sarasota Bay or other locations, places with long residence times where there are plenty of places where the empirically driven nutrient load chlorophyll relationship just doesn't work. And are there places in Tampa Bay where, maybe a different approach would be helpful? And I like the last part about making a prediction and then collecting the data and find out how accurate that is, because I think that's a really neat approach. I like that.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. One thing, from the get-go with the original models, the original WASP model and the original Tampa Bay empirical models were developed at the same time using the same estimated external loads. We tried to make them as consistent. Well, we wanted to make sure that they were given the same information to start with, and then the question was, will they generate similar predictions? Because if they do, that gives you more confidence in what the predictions are. If they don't, they're telling you, okay, well, we've got an issue here that we need to work on. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to continue doing these things.
Marcus has a question.
Yeah, hopefully this is a quick question. I probably should know the answer to this. And I don't want to distract from the need to further explore the sediment diagenesis as the missing piece here, but I'm wondering if to how much of the difference in how well the model is predicting compared to the observed data is related to differences in scale between the spatial units for which the model applies to those broad base segments versus the data collected by EPC, which are these fixed locations, which I'm assuming you're sort of aggregating at the segment level to compare to the model estimates. But in the process of doing that, are you sort of crossing lines with how you're sort of comparing things on the same spatial scale, and if there's a better way or potential to do that to better capture the skill of the model? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And in the draft report, for today, I just did everything on the whole bay, the bay-wide scale. In the draft report, we also have we're making comparisons between observed and simulated values at the model segment scale, or at the bay segment scale and at the model segment scale. So it is possible, and I think those are in the appendices of that report.
Okay.
So you can go in and take a look and see, okay, in particular model segments, is the model doing better or worse than in some other model segments? But yeah, that information's in there.
Okay. Is there,
very good point.
Short follow-up, are there some parts of the bay that are predicted better than others?
I'd have to go and look. I think it probably depends on which parameter you're looking at, that sort of thing. I don't remember any real major differences, but yeah, it would be very interesting to go in and take a look and see if there are those kinds of patterns in the observed and predicted values in model scale. Yep.
Cool. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you.
Chris A is asking, does WASP-8 consider macroalgae as an internal nitrogen pathway?
It can. We didn't do that here because we were trying to keep this version as consistent as possible with the WASP-4 version, which couldn't do that. So there are a number of things like that could be turned on in WASP-8, and I think we should. I mean, there's, you can do bid thick microalgae. There are a lot of things that you can do in WASP-8 that couldn't be done in WASP-4. But we were just trying to keep this an apples to apples comparison of the original model for now.
Well, thanks so much, y'all. That draft report is available on tbep.org on the Google Drive and linked in the agenda. So please review and provide Gerald any comments, or if you want to send them via my email, if that's easier, I'll happy to forward them on as well. We're right at noon. I just wanted to bring your attention to the proposed meeting dates for next year. I think it's kind of worked out nice to have roughly quarterly kind of meeting and allow y'all to get these meetings on your calendars. So this is what we're thinking about now. TBD if they'll be virtual like this, a hybrid, or if we'll get to meet face to face again. But if you can lock the dates down on your calendars, and then just also know that these dates were for the October meeting. Right now they're tentative. We're still finalizing negotiations with the location, but the idea is that quarterly meeting in fall would be replaced by the basis ANEP meeting that we're looking to host here in the region. So we hope you all can set aside some funds in your budget to participate in that as well. I don't know if anybody has any announcements. I have one quick thing in there. The Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition, which spans from Citrus down to Sarasota counties, is hosting a series of workshops in advance of creating a regional resiliency action plan. And the first of those meetings is scheduled for next Friday. And we'll be talking about relevant climate indicators and what we would need, what kind of data needs that we'd have to put together a regular report on sort of the state of the climate in Tampa Bay. Trying to do a better job of cross-pollinating that group with some of the expertise from this group. So if you're able to participate, please join us. The link to register is also included in the agenda. Dave, did you have an announcement to make? You raise your hand. Marcus?
Just wanted to quickly announce the Open Science Subcommittee meeting. The fall meeting is next week, I believe Tuesday the 27th. I know many of you are on that email list, so you should have got a notification about that. So I just want to remind everybody that is going to be next week.
Fine, Dave, you raised your hand like you had something to say. If y'all don't know, Dave's going to be joining the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program as their new executive director later on in November. So he's officially coming back home to the NEPs.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to working with a lot of you guys and getting more integrated between the NEPs. And, you guys are a well-run NEP, and so is Sarasota Bay. I'm thinking we can learn a lot from you, and hopefully you can learn a lot from us as well.
Definitely are looking forward to that.
Just one last announcement, Maya.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, there is another Open Science webinar opportunity on October 29th that's being hosted to the Association of National Estuary Programs. It's our fall tech webinar transfer series. So if you had an interest in that, we'll share that with the tech as well. You do have to register for that webinar.
I'll try and get a tech e-blast out either Friday or Monday of next week, and I'll include that link in there for everybody. All right, go forth and do good.
Any other comments, statements, concerns?
Aaron, just one quick update to the group. Our seagrass mapping is proceeding on schedule. We've completed all the mosaic and post-processing of the imagery, so we are now fully in the photo interpretation phase. So we expect to start getting some draft line work here in the next week or so. We're still on target to release the draft map sometime in the early part of 21, with the final maps being released sometime probably around March or April timeframe. But I'll keep you guys posted on that.
Do you want to give us a sneak peek on what we can expect, or are you going to save that for later?
I'm going to save that for a little later. Yeah, we'll save that till I actually start seeing some of the draft maps. I haven't seen the line work yet. I should be seeing that here in the next couple weeks, so there'll definitely be more to follow. And I will be working with all of you to get a convening of the Southwest Florida Seagrass Working Group probably sometime around early spring of 21 to kind of go over what we're seeing. So stay tuned for that as well.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to say that's a reminder for me to start sending out discussion about that meeting and see who wants to present.
Yeah, and I'll get with you, Gary, offline, and we'll work a little bit more. I've got some timelines that I can go over with you, so we can time that.
Sounds good.
All right.
And just to pitch Chris to remember that we're trying to get the annual compliance assessment submitted to DEP. We'd like to do it in March if we can. So the earlier you can get us that data, especially if we're interested in Old Tampa Bay, but
Yeah, I understood, Maya, and I don't intend to wait until the entire coast is released. As I get draft, and I've prioritized Tampa Bay to Charlotte Harbor as the first estuaries that they're working on, because we've mapped the whole district coast this year. So we've got seagrass mapping from Waukesasa Bay near Cedar Key all the way down to Charlotte Harbor, but we're prioritizing Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, and Charlotte Harbor for obvious reasons, for many reasons. So
we appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And not that it's a competition, but just as long as we're doing better than Sarasota Bay, that's what we're looking for this year.
I think you'll be happy. I think there's a reason why I'm the director.
Chris, whenever you want to get together and chat about some of the data products for the seagrass coverage maps, let me know. I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay, sounds good.
And actually, for the RAMP meeting, or I'm sorry, the Seagrass Working Group meeting, I think that's what we had originally talked about having something ready by then. So whenever, I guess, you and Gary have a discussion, maybe I could be included in that.
Will do.
Yeah, we'll get a meeting invite out to Gary, whoever you think should be in on that.
Well, I've got the constant contact email list for, I don't know, a couple 300 people.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Well, if there's nothing else that we need to attend to, I think we will